When opportunity knocks at the door, don't say, blimey, I've still got my pyjamas on. Say yes to stuff and it will take you interesting places.
We're clearly going through some very unusual times and enormous difficulties getting groups of people to agree on things.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the City of London, join us on Leaders with Lacqua.
अच्छा सुनो, कोई घर पे तो नहीं है ना? अरे नहीं नहीं, कोई नहीं है, बस दादाजी हैं, वो भी सो रहे हैं, तो चल।
हाँ भी कित्थों? ओ दादाजी मैं ना वो मेरी दोस्त आई सी, मैं छड्डन चलिया सी हूँ बस। इधर आ दादाजी, मैं बस वो मैनू सब पता है, दाढ़ी ना इतना ही चिट्टी नहीं हुई, नाले ना मैं तेरी उम्र च बहुत आशिकी मारी है। आजा मैं थानू दोनों को अपनी स्टोरी दसदा, ले अपनी दोस्त नू अंदर आजा। आ गल ना 1965 दी, मैं भी तेरी उम्र दा सीगा, 21 सालां दा। मैं भी तेरे वांगू कॉलेज पढ़दा सी ते उत्थे मैनू तेरी दादी मिली।
एक कुड़ी मिली टॉल, नीरी लगदी सी डॉल, कल करके ओ कॉल, कहंदी जट्टा तेरे प्यार विच फॉल हो गई। एक कुड़ी मिली टॉल, नीरी लगदी सी डॉल, कल करके ओ कॉल, कहंदी जट्टा तेरे प्यार विच फॉल हो गई। हो जिद्दां जिद्दां घुमदे सी टहर मेरी कार दे, ओदां ओदां घुमदी सी पिछे हो यार दे। समझ ता आ गई सिचुएशन जो बनी सी, महकदी सी ओहो जिवें फुੱਲ ने पहाड़ दे। मैं भी मार ली ब्रेक, मैं क्या वट कहंदी वेट, सूट पाया सी सफेद, कहंदी जट्टा थोड़े वाली तां कमाल हो गई। एक कुड़ी मिली टॉल, नीरी लगदी सी डॉल, कल करके ओ कॉल, कहंदी जट्टा तेरे प्यार विच फॉल हो गई।
हुण तुसी अपनी स्टोरी दसो।
कहंदी जचदे ओ बाल तुसी हाय फ्रंट सीट ते, देखी थोड़ी स्नैपचैट कल मैं रिपीट ते। दिल तेज बीट ते पारा मेरा हीट ते, कहंदी थोड़े नाल जाना क्लब एंड वीक ते। हत्थां विच हत्थ पाके नचांगे फ्लोर ते, गल अगे वधू खोलो दिल वाले डोर जे। मैं क्या गिव सम टाइम, दिल करो थोड़े राइम। शी सेड ओके इट्स फाइन, कहंदी जट्टा अटैच थोड़े नाल हो गई। एक कुड़ी मिली टॉल, नीरी लगदी सी डॉल, कल करके ओ कॉल, कहंदी जट्टा तेरे प्यार विच फॉल हो गई। कहंदी कट्टो तुसी कॉल, नहीं ते कर दूं ब्लॉक, ओदे फॉलोवर वेख नवजीत होया शौक। फिर लगी मैनू सोनी, मैं क्या बेबी लेट्स टॉक। मैं क्या जिद्दां जिद्दां कहोगे मैं ओदां ओदां करूंगा, जिद्दां जिद्दां चलोगे मैं ओदां ओदां चलूंगा। जिन्ना चिर रहोगे मैं कॉल ते ही रहूंगा। ए सुन लालो लाल हो गई, ओ रब्बा ए कमाल हो गई। प्यार विच फॉल हो गई, प्यार विच फॉल हो गई।
irrespective of gender, race, sexual orientation, can reach their full potential. We haven't gotten to where we need to get, I would say, particularly with respect to African Americans at lower levels, below the senior management levels. We have a challenge, and I think we're going to have to step up to that challenge. And the way that you do that is, frankly, you begin to establish targets, and you manage to those targets in the best way you can, consistent with how you have to run your company.
Now, your company not only has an African-American CEO, but an African-American lead outside director, Les Brun, maybe the only company in the country with those kind of with African-Americans in both those positions. But your board recently allowed you to stay beyond the normal retirement age of 65. So they obviously want you to stay. But how long are you planning to stay? And are you asked to go into public office, cabinet, or run for a president, run for Senate, run for governor? You ask that all the time, and what is your response?
Well, I'm going to stay as long as the board wants me to stay. I serve at their pleasure, obviously. I will say that there are great internal candidates for my job. We have a very strong management bench here at Merck. And so the board will make a decision as to when they think it's the right time for that transition. As it relates to, politics outside Merck, sometimes people mention that to me, but I have a hard time taking them seriously.
Well, let's suppose you didn't go into politics, and let's suppose at some point you leave before you're 80. What would you want to do next?
David, one of the things that I care about very much is dealing with this issue of societal inequality, income inequality. And another important area is access to justice. And so I think there are lots of opportunities for somebody who cares about those kinds of issues to get involved in causes that actually help people. I mentioned before, I was born in a fairly humble situation, and I feel like I've been extremely blessed to be where I am now. And so I think to the extent that I've been able to be successful, I have to think about using my resources as a tool to help other people.
Now, you and I have worked together on access to justice issues. For those who aren't familiar with that, what is the basic problem with access to justice? Doesn't everybody get the right to have a lawyer in this country if they need one?
No, they don't have that right. So let's start with the civil side of the equation. For many people, they face existential almost crises all the time with respect to housing, with respect to, let's say, domestic abuse, with respect to parental rights, with respect to getting government benefits to which they're entitled. And, we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In some ways, for many people in this country, you can't have life, liberty, or pursue happiness if you don't have a lawyer, because so much depends on how the legal system works. And we believe in this concept of equal justice under law, but you can't have that equal justice under law if many, many poor people, disadvantaged people, could never even dream of having a lawyer. And I think some of the greatest heroes in our society are legal aid lawyers, legal services lawyers, public defenders, who have this huge amount of caseload, but can't even begin to make a dent. And as Americans, whether we're corporate America, whether we're government, whether we're civil society, we have to recognize that we claim to believe in this creed, equal justice under law, but it's not a reality.
So given your position and your background, do you consider yourself a role model for other African Americans and other CEOs? And do you want to be a role model, or you don't want to really be a role model?
I don't think I have a choice because of the scarcity. There's only 4 African Americans in the Fortune 500. When I was coming up, I obviously looked at lawyers who are African Americans like Thurgood Marshall and Bill Coleman and others. And I hope that I serve that role for people. I try every day to perform in such a way as to give people confidence that they can do what I can do. Because I will say, I do feel a little bit like an imposter in the sense that by fortune, I happen to be put on that bus as opposed to kids that grew up around me. And I know that changed the trajectory of my life.
Ken, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. I hope the vaccine comes as quickly as possible. And good luck to you. And I look forward to working with you in the future on access to justice matters.
Thank you, David. And I'm optimistic that one of these companies will come up with a vaccine that will help the American people and people around the world.
first I was disappointed because I thought, oh, I'm not going to be able to have the picture in front of the, the emblem and the flag and all of that. But then I thought, how great is it that they're making this opportunity available that I don't have to wait? So actually it was fine.
Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
Airbnb was sailing on top of the travel world, expanding from a global home-sharing juggernaut into experiences, hotels, and transportation, on the verge of filing paperwork to go public in what was expected to be the biggest stock listing of the year. Then came COVID-19, and travel came to a standstill. Airbnb had $1 billion in cancellations almost immediately. Then came angry hosts.
We are collectively outraged.
Layoffs, and the economy went into recession. With no end to the pandemic in sight and only uncertainty ahead, travelers are slowly starting to venture out once again. But the captain of the Airbnb ship says travel will never be the same.
Joining me today on Bloomberg Studio 1.0, Airbnb CEO and co-founder Brian Chesky. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me on, Emily.
I'd like to start by rewinding a little bit. Despite what was happening in China, the force with which the pandemic hit took so many of us, so many businesses by surprise. Take me back to the moment when you realized that this was going to massively disrupt your business and change the course of Airbnb's history.
We have a pretty good-sized business in China, so we got some early indicators in January that something was happening. But I don't think any of us could have imagined that what was going to happen in China was going to spread and was essentially going to lead to an entire global shutdown. Late February, things started looking concerning. Our growth basically went to flat or below previous year's levels. And we were preparing for a crisis like 9/11 or 2008. We said, this stuff happens every once in a while. You need to be prepared. But none of us were prepared for really a once-in-a-century crisis. Our industry, travel, has described COVID as big as 9/11 and 2008 many times over, something more akin to World War II. And when that happened, it felt like I was working on our S1. We were going to file it March 31, and it felt like 12 years of success and, had all these things and life was great. And suddenly you build something in 12 weeks and you lose most of it in 4 weeks. I can't quite describe what that feels like. And it just felt like everything in the company broke. I felt like a captain of a ship and a torpedo just hit the side of the ship. We were the tip of the sphere. We were felt immediately. 2.5 billion people were shut down, and this became an existential crisis. As an industry, we had to stare into the abyss, and we didn't know if and when it would recover.
Now, travel came basically to a standstill, and in many cases, people didn't want to travel or they couldn't travel legally. It was illegal to rent an Airbnb. What was the lowest point for you? The darkest hour?
There were so many dark hours. That's the old quote attributed to Winston Churchill: if you're going through hell, just keep going. And man, I will tell you, the first dark moment was when we had about $1 billion of cancellations from guests. All of a sudden, we get a huge number of cancellations. We weren't prepared for them, and they're calling customer service. Well, customer service call centers are shut down. So now we have to handle a huge amount of volume of cancellations working from home. So anyone that wanted cancellation, we offered an extenuating circumstance policy. We refunded them. But then suddenly there was an uproar. Hosts were really upset. And over the last 10 years, we've had a pretty good relationship with hosts. And then suddenly there were viral videos of hosts being really upset with us. We took $250 million of our own money and we sent it to hosts. It was the most we could afford to do during our darkest financial hour. And we're just completely scrambling. And I think that at that moment, not even knowing if and when people would travel again, that was pretty ominous, pretty harrowing. And that's the moment, like, I think a leader has to step up.
You also had to cut 25% of the company, and you gave, an incredibly generous severance package. Your note to the team, I could feel the pain in there. Talk to me about going through that process, cutting 25% of your staff.
It was the saddest thing I've ever done in my life, at least professionally. And we weren't sure if we'd have to do a layoff, and we had to face the hard truth that travel, we did not know when it was going to return. And we knew that when travel returned, it would be different. It would never be the same. And it's been really hard. Having to say goodbye to 2,000 people was incredibly sad. And now every day I told our team, we come to work for them because I need to make sure that the work they created will not just disappear in vain, that we're going to carry it forward.
So let's talk about the future. You mentioned you don't think travel will ever be the same. What does travel look like?
I don't know for sure, but here's what I'll say. Travel will be back, but it will look different. For now, here's what's going to happen. People are starting to say they want to travel again. They don't want to cross borders. They don't want to go to dense urban cities. They don't want to wait in line, and they don't want to travel for business. What they want to do is they want to get in cars, and they want to drive not more than 200-300 miles and stay in a home with people they care about. People are going to rediscover small communities around them. That travel's not going away, but it's going to be balanced. So instead of just Paris, it's going to be Petaluma, it's going to be Pittsburgh, it's going to be small communities. People are going to get in their cars, they're going to discover these communities. It'll be more experiential, it'll be more authentic, more local.
That's right, Airbnb is a global company. What trends are you seeing in Europe, in Asia, versus the United States?
So United States has been very, very strong. We've seen a temporary recovery in the United States. Europe, most of Europe, we've seen a recovery, a temporary recovery, other than the United Kingdom. United Kingdom, I think, is still locked down until July 1. But France, Germany, Italy, Spain, you're seeing really strong growth. Latin America is not recovered, and Asia is starting to recover, but not yet recovered. So North America and Europe are extremely strong. Latin America, Asia, kind of a bit behind.
Now, given new waves of the virus, and you saying that Airbnb certainly isn't out of the woods yet, what are you most worried about? What is keeping you up at night?
Well, I mean, we're absolutely not out of the woods. There could be a second wave. It could be pent-up demand. And also, we have other issues, like we have so much more demand around than we thought, so now customer service wait times are long. So we have new issues. There's always a challenge. And so I ultimately think we need to be totally focused on serving our community, getting back to our roots, back to basics of belonging, connection, and rebuild our company. And if we can rebuild our company, then maybe we can hire some of the people back that we lost.
How much do you think getting back to normal depends on a vaccine, or even then, things are going to be different?
They're going to be different. Travel as you knew it is over. You're never, ever going to see it again. I'll just say that right there. And I think business travel is really, really going to be hit for a while. I think a lot of people are realizing they can do meetings on Zoom. They're rethinking a lot of the conventions and conferences. People are going to rediscover the outdoors. For example, there's 400 national parks in the country. Most Americans have never been to a national park. Most Americans don't even know they live within 200 miles of a national park. I think one prediction, national parks are going to be in. People are going to travel a lot more outdoors. These are things that are going to happen. And the other thing that I think is going to happen is travel and living are going to blend together. What do I mean? Well, if you can do your job from home, then if you can work from home, you could theoretically work from any home, anywhere in the world, so long as you're in the right time zone. And so what you're going to start to see is not just travel redistribution, but you might see, and no one can say for sure, population redistribution. People may start moving to smaller towns and communities, or they may say, I'm going to live a few months here, a few months there. Why couldn't you if you can do your job behind your computer? And so we're going to start to see a real fundamental rethinking of travel and probably even urban living. And I can't say how it's going to play out for sure, but these are some trends that seem pretty obvious to me.
Meantime, in the midst of a pandemic, you've launched online experiences so you can get an Olympic athlete lesson. You can participate in virtual pride festivities. How popular have these experiences been, and how big could this be in terms of being part of your business going forward?
I think that experiences could be as big or probably bigger than our homes business in the long run. It's going to take a lot longer, but it's possibly a bigger idea. The biggest asset in your life is not your home, it's your time. And just like COVID is going to, like restaurants are shut down, sports are shut down, we're going to see is a whole new era of entertainment. And I don't think it's not just going to be streaming. People are going to want interactive experiences with one another. And if all recent surveys suggest humans are more lonely than they've ever been in the longest of time. Instead of just going to a restaurant or watching something at home on Netflix, maybe there's a third thing you can do. And if you don't want to leave your home, you can actually have an experience, or you can do the same thing with a baker or an artist, some creative person. And so I think it's going to take a long time. I don't know how big online experiences will be. It is our fastest growing product. It's done about $1 million in bookings so far with only 400 experiences. So you can give that a sense of proportion. But I think in the long run, the overall category, it's going to be a really, really big category. It's going to take decades to play out though.
So given that you've made this investment, you've scaled back on hotels, transportation, and some of these other things that you were pursuing, how does that change Airbnb's overall wider strategy? Like, what is your vision for Airbnb now? I think it's not much about travel. We have travel, but it's about belonging, connection. It's about hosting. So we're really focused on the business of hosting. Regular people that want to offer experiences, they want to offer homes. And I think down the road, they can offer many more things. So I think you'll probably see Airbnb even go beyond travel. For example, nearly 20% of our nights booked are for people staying in homes longer than 30 days. And as I said before, because of like working from home, people now will want extended living. What we sell is connection. And when it works out, you might feel like you belong in the community you visit. That's what it is. It's much more focused, much more about where it came from. And we're going to expand from there. When we go public, I think it will be successful. And I think that people will be really happy. And I do think we'll be public sooner than later.
The national security bill was passed by Chinese lawmakers. The Hong Kong police force has already acted in accordance with the new law.
It's a very disturbing development.
This is, in effect, an attempt to end one country, two systems.
The central government is telling us just stay out of politics.
Airbnb was going to go public this year. You had the S1 ready. It was going to be potentially the biggest stock listing of the year. You haven't ruled out going public this year. Where are you with that?
We were ready to file March 31, so we'll be ready to file again. And the real question is, when's the world ready for us? And are they ready for us this year? Are they ready for us next year? Hard to say. I will say that we're recovering faster than we thought, but I also don't want to have false hope. You know, hope for the best, plan for the worst. The market seems like it's recovering, but again, there could be a double dip. So we're going to kind of play it by year. I want a little more data. We're still a little early in this crisis for me to feel clear enough about how this is going to play out. So we're not rolling it out this year, but we're definitely not committing to a timeline right now.
So how likely is it that it would happen this year, and how do you weigh those uncertainties?
I wouldn't want to speculate or give a percentage. So I can just say it's on the table, but we're definitely not committing to it. The fundamental questions are: does travel continue to recover? Number two, is it a sustainable recovery, or is it just pent-up demand? Number three, does the market have an appetite for companies listing that lost a bit of appetite after the IPOs last year, and then WeWork, like people kind of lost appetite a little bit. It seems like appetite's coming back. These are really fundamental questions, and if those things start to align, you start opening up a bit of a window. The other thing I just point out is there does seem to be an acceleration of adoption for Airbnb right now. So this is an opportunity for us, and it's probably just because it's like what people are just going with what the available options are. A lot of hotels aren't open yet. So we also don't know how sustainable the recovery is. Is it a temporary mix shift or not? So these are things that we're going to be following.
Now, the timing of Airbnb going public means a lot to employees who made a bet on Airbnb's future for their future. And I'm wondering if you've thought through this, why aren't you already public? Should you have gone out earlier? Was that a mistake?
I think we're going to look back on this period, and when we go public, I think it will be successful. And I think that people will be really happy. And I do think we'll be public sooner than later. I just don't know what sooner means. But I mean, I actually think we'll look back at it, and hopefully it'll play out well. I mean, I just want you to know, we have a real responsibility to our stakeholders. It means a lot to me that employees have a significant part of their net worth in our stock, that we have shareholders that held the stock for nearly a decade. And so it's really important to me that they get liquidity. But I also think that, we're going to have a really great year ahead of us. So I think things could work out for people.
I wonder if Airbnb expanded too much, too far, too fast. And if hindsight's 2020 now, I know nobody was prepared for a pandemic, but do you think that was a miscalculation?
I think that we were a little unfocused, and we strayed from our roots, and we strayed from connection, belonging, and hosting. And we were pursuing a lot of things. These were worthy things. Somebody once told me you can do everything you want in life, not at the same time. Well, when you get really successful, you tend to think you can do everything at the same time. And I think that's a really big mistake that a lot of founders made. And I tried to do probably too many things at once. It wasn't as clear until COVID happened and we had the discipline. And I'll give you an example. Our US business, we had the same volume business as last year, but we cut a run rate of nearly $1 billion in marketing. We are not doing any paid advertising, online marketing at all. It doesn't mean it wasn't effective, we shouldn't have done it, but it really makes you rethink how much do you need to do, and can we be more scrappy? So the company, I think, was inherently probably more profitable than we thought it was, because you don't really ever know until you stop doing everything. And then you start to see what you really need and what is essential. So it was this moment where you get to look at it with clear eyes. And I think we all looked at it with fresh eyes and realized we need to be leaner, we need to get back to our basics, and we need to be focused. And then hopefully that more focused company will grow even faster. And then we can launch new things. And then we can scale, expand, be big again, but in a more focused way. And then hopefully hire the people back that we lost. We're committed to remaining in China, and it's just going to be a different pace than it was before.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Protests have been happening around the world in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. You have made new commitments, set new goals for Airbnb. That 20% of your board and executive team will be people of color by the end of next year. Your teams are being given recruitment and retention goals that they have to meet by 2025. This sounds like quotas, which have been controversial because the critics would say this is forcing people to hire people they wouldn't hire otherwise. Why do you feel like this is the best way to achieve what you want to achieve?
Well, I mean, there's many things we're doing. We're not just identifying targets, but I mean, I think diversity doesn't just happen. It's got to be intentional. Diversity does not come to you. The world's not going to come to you. You want to make a more just, equitable world. You don't just wish for it. You got to work towards it. And you got to sometimes do things that are a little unpopular and you need to press against it. We can either choose to be a mirror to the society that exists, or we can choose a different path to lead our way forward. I think that starts with looking in the mirror and saying we're not where we need to be and being honest about that and saying, okay, we're going to do a lot of work to get there. And so I'm not apologetic. I'm not going to apologize about trying to step into the future, even if it's going to be really hard. And I'll just tell you one other story. In 2016, there was a hashtag that was trended on Twitter. It was called #AirbnbWhileBlack. And it was Black guests, especially in the United States, describing being discriminated against when they were trying to book a home. Now, I will tell you, as one of 3 white founders in their mid-20s who started Airbnb, it did not occur to me at the time, I was naive, that our product would be used in that way. Had I grew up in other circumstances, then I might have thought that. So this was a wake-up call. And so we've been working for the last 4 years. And over the last 2 years, we've been working with Color of Change, leading civil rights groups and privacy groups. And we have this vision. We don't just want to measure anecdotes, complaints of discrimination. We want to measure systemic bias and discrimination on our platform. To my knowledge, no internet company has ever tried to measure bias and discrimination on their platform through broad collection of data.
What is the data? Is this still happening, and how much?
It was a very low bar. We asked everyone on Airbnb to attest that they will not discriminate other people on the basis of race, religion, orientation, gender. And you know what? 1.3 million people chose not to check that box and not to participate. And I think we're better off because they weren't really committed to what we're committed to. I think we're in the beginning of a journey. I hope you have me back on the show and I can tell you about the progress we've made. I do commit that we're going to publicly report our progress. And that, by the way, is some of the best ways to make progress, when you know you're on the hook. And if you don't make progress, you have to tell the world. I'm not going to want to come back on your show and put out the data and say, Emily, I've made no progress. So that's some pretty good motivation. You know, we internet companies this is a watershed moment. And I think what's happening now is we're realizing we, the platforms, need to take more responsibility for the content that's created on our platforms. This is something that seems completely obvious. Now, the extent to you want to take that responsibility is going to vary by platform, but we better not think that it's up to government to decide what responsibility we should take, because by the time they enforce, the damage is going to be done. We have to be in partnership. And so I think that we need to lead the way. The best thing for shareholders are companies, I think, who have consumers believe they're doing the right thing. This is both, I think, the right thing to do, but I also think it's quite self-interest for shareholders to do this as well.
In New York, you just settled a major lawsuit with New York City and agreed to hand over personal data on hosts. This is one of your biggest domestic markets. It could cost you thousands of listings in the city. How will this experience in New York change your relationship with other cities and your strategy going forward?
Well, New York has been a 10-year-long debate, and it's been the biggest holdout of any city in the country. Almost every major city, we've come to agreement. We collect hotel tax, and we're one of the largest collectors of hotel tax in the world. New York has been a market we have not had resolution until now. I think what COVID did is it led to a big reset moment, kind of for everyone, right? Like everything kind of felt like it got reset a bit. And so suddenly I think we in cities took a fresh look at all this. And we've come to an agreement that I think was months in the making. It's going to lead to a smaller Airbnb for now in New York, but I think we can rebuild from that. And I think it's an outcome that we all feel like we can live with.
Meantime, it all comes back to China. You are one of the few US tech companies that still has a physical footprint in China. Google, Facebook, Twitter have all left or given up. How important is China still to you, and how much of a setback is the pandemic to your ambitions there?
It doesn't change our ambitions. It does change the size of the business for now. China's hit very hard, and China has not recovered as much as other countries. And so our ambition's the same, that we want to help people connect in every country in the world. We don't want to cut out 1.4 billion people. I mean, that really wouldn't get you very far to bringing people together. But it has made us take a longer horizon because it's pretty, it's been definitely impacted. And, you know, we're going to be pacing ourselves.
So you're still committed to maintaining the business there, given the challenges and the risks?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're committed to remaining in China, and it's just going to be a different pace than it was before.
Given all of these changes, what you've experienced, a pandemic that has changed the course of history and your history, Airbnb is bound to be a different company than it was going to be otherwise. What does Airbnb look like to you a year from now and 5 years from now?
I think a year from now, people are going to look at Airbnb, and instead of seeing just real estate, they're going to see hosts. They're going to say Airbnb is not just a marketplace, Airbnb is a community. And what they sell aren't just ways to save money while you travel, what they're selling really is connection. Now, these can be words. They can sound like empty marketing. I want to acknowledge that. I got to prove that. I got to deliver on that. I probably don't even deserve to use those words, except you're asking about what I hope to be able to say. So I hope a year from now, I don't even have to say those words. I hope you say that about us because we've earned that. And in 5 years from now, I hope that we go so much further, that we've created millions of entrepreneurs. You know, more than half our entrepreneurs, by the way, are women. It's totally different than like other sharing economy companies that are dominated by men on the supply side. And I think we can provide economic opportunity for entrepreneurs all over the world, an entire creative class of people. I think we can help create educational experiences. I mean, a lot of travel is educational. I think we can transcend. And ultimately, I think if we're successful, I think that you're going to connect Airbnb to feeling like you're a little bit more connected to other people. I want it to be real connections, not just like digital connections.
All right, Brian Chesky, thank you for making the connection with us today. It's been great to have you here on the show.
Does, as you say, have some catching up to do on that front. So we are expecting to see a little bit of strength coming through at the start of trade. How long will it last, though? The perennial question.
Cities across the United States are gradually reopening, hoping for a quick recovery amidst a devastating pandemic and one of the biggest crises in modern history. In Boston, the COVID-19 crisis already adds up to $65 billion in lost revenue, more than double initial projections. What's the way forward?
I spent a lot of time trying to encourage people in Massachusetts to keep doing what you're doing. We can't take our foot off the gas.
And how can Boston gradually reopen its businesses and storied educational institutions?
We have to assume that this disease could be with us at least throughout this academic year.
And with its vibrant biotech sector, can the city lead the way in the race for a vaccine?
Businesses that want to stay open in the midst of this will need some level of regular testing to do it.
We speak with Boston's best and brightest, the executives, policymakers, and educators on the front lines in this special edition of Bloomberg Technology, Boston, the Road to Recovery. Welcome to a special edition of Bloomberg Technology, Boston, the Road to Recovery. I'm Emily Chang. We begin with a conversation about Boston's leadership through a health, economic, and social crisis as the city slowly begins to reopen.
Initially, it was getting PPE to our frontline workers. We had people working in hospitals, nurses and doctors, EMTs, firefighters who just didn't have the masks and the gear that they needed. And so that was a real challenge, getting PPE into the state. A second challenge was the really dire situation, people getting laid off from work, people who were food and housing insecure, especially in low-income communities, especially in Black and brown communities. And that was a real challenge and remains a challenge. And then finally, I think just adopting to how we were going to communicate. Everything has been done virtually. For doctors, it was learning to get them licensed to provide telemedicine, for example, to their patients. So a lot of challenges in the early days, probably most of all, just not knowing what we were going to get from the federal government. And frankly, the federal government not being there to support our state or other states in the way they should have.
So what's the situation now?
I think the situation is better. I think that people have worked really hard in Massachusetts to stay at home, wear masks, and really do what we should be doing during this time. And that's why you've seen our infection rates go way, way down. You see what's happening in other parts of the country where people just didn't behave that way, and the numbers are going through the roof. So the situation on the ground here is good. Our hospitals, our incredible hospitals, have worked so hard here in the last few months. And so I feel good about that. But I'm also nervous that as we start to reopen, people will let their guard up and not take the safe measures that they need to continue to take, because we're not going to see a vaccine for a while. I think the other problem is our economy, our restaurants in particular, small businesses. So many just shut down and probably have shut down for good. So I think building and rebuilding an economy here is really important. Colleges and universities, they're a big part of Boston and Massachusetts and our economic picture as well. And obviously they're in really dire straits right now. And so there's a lot still to wrestle with, but I'm proud of the people of Massachusetts. I think everybody's really tried to work hard together to get through to this point.
As you mentioned, Boston is home to world-class universities, hospitals, vaccine makers. How concerned are you as we're seeing cases now spiking again across the country?
Well, I'm concerned because you could have students coming from all over onto campuses here in Boston in a few months. And if they're carrying coronavirus with them, they put all of us at risk here. So I'm certainly concerned about that. But I do think we are so fortunate in Massachusetts to not only have amazing life sciences, biotech, research institutions that are truly on the front lines now in developing treatments and a vaccine, in addition to really world-class healthcare. And so we're fortunate in that way. But I am nervous about spikes as we approach the fall. And I spent a lot of time trying to encourage people in Massachusetts, keep doing what you're doing. We can't take our foot off the gas.
So obviously, children aren't as seriously impacted by the virus. From a health perspective, what have the cases of COVID-19 among children looked like to you? What have you been seeing at your hospital?
We have seen a number of children come through, both with the virus, but also with this new syndrome, the multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. We've seen about 150 children with positive COVID. Most of them have had a relatively mild form of the disease, and several of them have had more need for intensive care, but they've mostly been children with underlying disease. The more sick children are the ones with this new syndrome, and we've seen just over 30 of them in the last couple of weeks. So that has been our experience, but we've been preparing for the same kind of situation that even all the adult hospitals had to as well.
So that certainly counters the point that some have tried to make that children are, quote unquote, basically immune to this virus. I mean, how concerned should we be about our children out there?
Well, children, have been testing positive. Many of them have tested positive and are not symptomatic. So the question is whether they are really also transmitters of the disease, even though they're not showing symptoms. And so that's something that we're still attempting to study to truly understand why this virus, unlike other flus, have not necessarily had the same degree of impact on children. And that's still a bit of a mystery, and therefore a lot of research that's going to go on to understand that.
What is the state of reopening there, and what's your view into how well businesses are surviving?
Well, so far it's going very well. There was a large joint effort, as you referred to, with the Mass High Tech Council, the Governor's Council, academics, business people, medical people. And we went through a huge effort under the leadership of the Mass High Tech Council to really look at the COVID-19. And this was probably 10 or 11 weeks ago, while people were focusing on fighting the virus at the hospital level. We were focusing on how would we reopen the economy once the hospitals were stabilized. And the governor and the Secretary of Health and Lieutenant Governor, I think, have done a very nice job in Massachusetts. In fact, I just saw the data today. Massachusetts has the lowest RT factor. It's 0.66 of all the 50 states right now. So far that program has worked very well.
Now, as the co-chair of Bain Capital, you've got such an interesting vantage point. What does the economic recovery look like to you? Is it a V shape or a deep V shape, as some have suggested?
Well, I think it's probably a kind of series of W's. We're going through right now nationally a second wave in many of the western states and Florida. And so that's going to, the markets dropped today, that's going to affect the economy. So it's very uncertain. The Fed has piled in with $10 trillion of government spending. And that's, I think, kept businesses going and the markets up and consumers, even with the high unemployment, spending. And therefore, it's kind of blunted the economic impact of the virus. But hopefully we can keep that up and get these other states turned around in time for some kind of therapeutics or a vaccine to come along in the first or second quarter. I'm much more optimistic about the progress they've made with therapeutics and vaccines. There's 100 and so efforts going on in the world right now to fight the virus. And we need a few of those to be successful. And hopefully they'll be successful in short order. Until then, we are going to be what I'll call an 80% economy, an economy shifting towards an e-economy. You've seen big increases in any kind of e-companies in terms of getting deliveries at home, food, goods, actually a boom in that area, where other businesses have suffered, especially businesses that require close contact.
As the economy starts to reopen, how do you expect companies to address this second shift, this shift that we are seeing on social issues, a new sort of social normal, if we will?
I think the first step is to acknowledge that companies have a problem, right? We've seen a lot of messages of solidarity going out there, but the first step is to look inside and look at the structural racism and sexism within their own ranks. And that's who's in the C-suite, who's on the board, who's holding the high-paying jobs. And so solidarity is one thing, real action is another. We actually had a shareholder proposal asking for greater action on racial and gender pay equity this spring, go to a vote at 10 different companies, at 10 different companies' annual meetings. And at all of those annual meetings, the management teams and the boards opposed the proposals. That's not meaningful change. And I wonder if that would happen now, 1 month later, 2 months later, as companies are really starting to reassess what they can do to both acknowledge the problem and change from the inside out.
Arjuna Capital, based in Boston, is an activist investor in Twitter and Google and Facebook. If these companies are going to continue to turn down your proposals, can you keep investing in them?
Well, we invest in these companies, in companies like Facebook, for instance, with the intent of engaging. We think they've got a strong platform, a strong position in the market, and we've been working for the last 4 years to press for change. And we've seen some change. I mean, you saw it's not enough because certainly there's consumers and users are unhappy. You have an advertiser boycott, but you did hear Mark Zuckerberg reference the 10 million pieces of hate speech that were removed from the platform in the first quarter. The reason we know about that is because Arjuna Capital pressed for transparency on that kind of reporting.
Coming up, from vaccines to cybersecurity, how businesses in Boston are stepping up. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Technology, Boston, the road to recovery.
Some things you see coming, some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. Pablo from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Welcome back to a special edition of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. For the second year in a row, Massachusetts took one of the top spots in Bloomberg's annual State Innovation Index. GE, Raytheon, Thermo Fisher, and Biogen are some of the biggest companies headquartered in the state, along with potentially leading vaccine makers like Merck, Sanofi, and Moderna.
The scientific and medical community believes that the biology of a virus is druggable. And so I think there's a high probability that several vaccines will make it to the finish line. It could be as early as the end of the year or early next year.
But the Boston area is also home to more than 40,000 small businesses. We spoke to some of the city's top executives about their company's road to recovery after months of sheltering in place.
We needed a lot of clinical diagnostics in sort of the first phase, the acute phase of the pandemic, where you really had doctors making decisions about people who were sick and needing to know, do they have COVID or not? We built up 300,000 or 400,000 tests like that in the United States in the last, kind of heroically in the last 3 or 4 months. Well, now what we need is much lighter weight testing. Ideally, it's not going to be a nurse administered swab. It would be something you could do yourself, either saliva or in the middle of your nose. And it would be collected just at your workplace. You wouldn't have to go anywhere. And you would do it maybe depending on how acute the outbreak is in your area, once a week or maybe once every 2 weeks, depending. And you need to actually model that. You have to do a little bit of epidemiological modeling to know, but that would be the idea.
What's been the interest from companies and schools so far? I mean, there's still so much uncertainty, and I'm sure many of them don't really know how often they're going to have to do this and for how long.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard, right? I mean, a ton of interest, but I think there's also just people are confused about this, and I think rightly, because we haven't, the last time we dealt with a pandemic at the scale that would close down the global economy was in 1918. It was 100 years ago. And so, of course, we don't have any of the infrastructure built to do this well. And so, we're seeing a lot of interest, especially among schools that are trying to open, but also really major employers. And again, it's partially a workplace safety issue, but Emily, it's also business continuity, right? Tyson had to shut down 6% of poultry production in the U.S. Ford had to close the F-150 plant. Businesses that want to stay open in the midst of this will need some level of regular testing to do it.
DraftKings is based in Boston. Curious how you've been engaging with the city of Boston as you plan for a return to work, as everything has been shut down, and now the economy is starting to slowly reopen.
Now, first of all, our initial focus and continued focus primary focus, I should say, is on making sure our employees are safe. They have an environment that they feel comfortable working in from home. As people talk about returning to work, we're ensuring, as per guidelines, that only the people who absolutely have to be in the office are coming back. And, we're also continuing to try to help with job growth. We've made 0 layoffs. We've continued to hire. And we're hopeful that we can even accelerate that more. But right now, we're continuing a pretty rapid pace of hiring, even through the pandemic.
You went public in the middle of a pandemic, and even more impressive, during a freeze on sports. What's it been like leading the company through this time?
It's been really interesting. It's when you think about early on, as you start a business, where you're going to go, you usually don't even think about going public. And if you do, you probably think about ringing the bell and kind of the typical setup, not, virtual bell ringings and, not seeing your employees for months at a time while you're going public. So it's been an unusual and, unexpected way that we did it. But overall, it's been really successful. We've been thrilled with the receptiveness that the market's had to us. Really, appreciative of all the people that have invested in us and believe in our vision and what we're going to hopefully be able to achieve. And, for us, a lot of it comes down to just continuing to execute well, hoping that states continue to progress with legislation. I'm hoping Massachusetts will get something done in the near future, because that obviously helps us continue to build our base here. And, if we continue to execute well and good things happen on the legislative front, I think that, things will take care of themselves on the financial side. And it's obviously distracting having a public stock price now, but trying not to watch it every day.
Many people don't realize that even though Converse is owned by Nike, you're based in Boston. What's been the process of retail stores closing, reopening? Where do things stand now?
Yeah, quick one there. Converse was founded over 120 years ago in New England, in Malden, Massachusetts. It's headquartered in Boston, and it's a wholly owned subsidiary of Nike. And it's kind of connected, but really independent. And so I'm based there, as well as hundreds of other employees are there. We do business in over 100 some odd countries, and North America is one of our key markets. As far as your question is around stores, Asia, fully operational. I'd say Europe, half and half, depending on the country and where they are in their kind of curve. And in North America, probably around half our stores are opening, and every day that changes based on kind of local government, regulations and what's going on in the shopping environment.
Right. Talk to us about what's happening regionally and what trends you're seeing.
Yeah, well, first, the biggest trend that we've seen, a trend that's already been there, which is that move to digital, with consumers buying and shopping and engaging with brands through their, mobile devices. that just accelerated in the last 90 days. So no matter what market you're in, that's grown at a very, very fast pace. But what's been really interesting is that as we've opened our retail stores, or our partners have opened retail stores in Asia and Europe and now in North America, our consumers wanting to get back out in the marketplace to shop and interact and be back with the brand has come back faster than we anticipated, which has been very, very good.
Now, speaking about supply and demand, my producer was surprised to find that the shoes she wanted to buy for her toddler were sold out. What's the story on the supply side?
Well, you know, you'll find in the world of sneakers and fashion, as you would know, that you know, it can be sold out for many different reasons. One is we didn't make enough, or by design, you know, scarcity is a part of the fashion model, that you make enough to what you think is going to satisfy a certain set of demand, but you know that you'll move on to what's next. So without knowing the exact shoe, I don't know. But what I can also tell you is that every brand is challenged right now as digital is accelerated. There's a certain pipe that enables you to go from idea in your mobile device to consumers' homes. That pipe hasn't really gotten much bigger, but consumers' demand using digital is up multiple rates. And so the pipe is full. And so what you'll find a lot of times is it's just taking longer for you to get your favorite sneaker or apparel than it would have been before COVID-19.
How much is this working from home just going to be part of our new habit?
I think it'll be very substantial for companies where employees can work from home. I think you'll see a large fraction of employees continue to do that. We've told our employees that they can work from home for the rest of the year. And I expect, you know, in the long run, maybe half of our employees will do that on a regular basis going forward. Sometimes employees need to come in, but for a lot of companies right now, they can work very successfully remotely, and that's, you know, safer to do, and in many cases more convenient for the employee.
Coming up, from the lecture hall to virtual classrooms, how some of the nation's top universities are adapting to the crisis and planning optimistically for the gradual return to campus. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Technology, Boston, the road to recovery.
Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
We return to a special Boston edition of Bloomberg Technology. The pandemic is upending higher education, perhaps in Boston more so than anywhere else in the country, with more than 24 colleges and universities in the area. Campuses have shut down and moved online. Now the big question is, when will students return?
And how will campus life be different?
If you look at this virus, one of the most insidious parts of this virus is the fact that it has a significant either asymptomatic fraction or what I call pre-symptomatic, where people can shed virus and infect other people, but they don't have symptoms. And because of that, we made the commitment back in April that we're going to do very significant PCR-based testing of our entire community. We rolled that out last week, and that will be testing everyone as they come back in the community to try to make sure that we're not bringing virus in, and then frequent testing of everyone that's coming in contact with the students and faculty throughout the semester.
Now, when it comes to COVID-19, are you anticipating integrating distance learning and a more flexible curriculum for, potentially 1, 2, 3 years to come? I mean, how long term will this be?
Well, see, I was raised to plan for the worst and hope for the best. And so I believe that all the things we put in place and the way we're talking about it is what we refer to as the new normal, is how we operate a residential university with COVID-19 in our midst. And I would love, like everyone else, to wake up in January and have a widely disseminated effective vaccine, but I don't think we can count on that. We have to assume that this disease could be with us at least throughout this academic year. And everything we are doing, every decision we're making, is to establish the kind of continuity we need to operate as a major research university throughout that period.
Do you see being integrated into the curriculum now, potentially more so for years to come, given the experience that parents and schools have had with your program over the last 4 months?
Given how unusual this back to school is going to be, whether it's a shift-based model, socially distanced model, hybrid model, I think there's just a reality that people are going to have to lean more on Khan Academy and video conferencing than they might have at any other time. And I do think some of this is going to have long-lasting implications. One silver lining of all of this is that people have been talking about the digital divide forever. And it's been very clear that as soon as the school closures hit, that there's a subset of kids, 20, 30%, who didn't have adequate internet and computers at home. That has always been a barrier for them to be able to adopt tools like Khan Academy. People are really serious about solving that. So I think it's going to allow, if that gets solved or gets closer to being solved, the whole system can lean more heavily on things like this than they normally would have.
And that does it for this special edition of Bloomberg Technology, Boston, the Road to Recovery. I'm Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Every which way and up, the markets continue to push against COVID-19 anxieties, and tech leads the way. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. This week, Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey.
It's not a one and done. We got that out of the way, check the box, we're good to go. This is an iterative reality that we're living with.
Governor Ned Lamont of Connecticut.
I think you're going to see a dynamic change. Let's face it, for the last 20 years, young people wanted to be in the major metro centers. Now I think there'll be a little balancing out.
Former senior economic advisor to President George W. Bush, Glenn Hubbard.
The stock market may have irrational exuberance, but it's not obvious. But even if the stock market's high, it doesn't mean the economy's fine at all.
Sharman Mosavar Rahmani of Goldman Sachs. And we bring back our roundtable, at least virtually, with contributors Larry Summers of Harvard and former Fed Governor Dan Tarullo. Nowhere to go. That's what the markets seem to reflect this week, as concerns about a resurgent coronavirus were overcome by a general sense of optimism. That and a good deal of liquidity that was burning a hole in investors' pockets. For many, it seemed there truly was no alternative.
Institutional investors are more confident than at the moment than about a possible crash than our retail investors.
But maybe for the first time, investors started to think about some real alternatives in Washington as President Trump's poll numbers continued to slip and Wall Street took a hard look at a possible Biden presidency and maybe even a Democratic Senate. To give us a peek now into what the markets might be thinking about, we welcome Sharman Mosavar Rahmani. She is Chief Investment Officer for Goldman Sachs Wealth Management. Sharman, welcome. It's good to have you on Wall Street Week. Give us some sense of what the markets are thinking, because there was enough reason to really pause this week when you have increased COVID-19 cases throughout the South in particular. You've got some problems with China. Maybe there's not going to be a phase 2 deal. You've even got a Joe Biden and maybe a Democrat Senate. So why are the markets continue to push up so relentlessly?
There's always things to worry about. In fact, we often use the expression that the markets climb the wall of worry. So the fact that there's more COVID incidents in the South and the West, and we actually are seeing fatalities go up, is definitely something to watch very carefully. But when we actually look at the turnaround in the economy, that's been quite dramatic. So we have gone from a steady decline, numbers looking pretty terrible on the unemployment insurance claims, the first-time claims being up like 6.8 million people at the peak, to now something like 1.3 million. So we're seeing a very big shift in the economy relative to what people were expecting. The data has surprised to the upside, whether we're looking at retail sales, whether we're looking at car sales, whether we're looking at mortgage applications, whether we're looking at the ISM manufacturing and non-manufacturing surveys, consumer confidence. So things are clearly improving, and the market is moving from pricing a very bad environment to where some people even use the term depression, which we never used, to actually being more optimistic that maybe 2020 will be a year that's down about 5% plus or minus a little bit in terms of economic growth. And then we recover by about 5 or 6% in 2021. So our view is that this is not an irrational market. Equity markets are forward-looking. So they're looking at what earnings will look like in 2021. We're already in July. There's a sense that from some of the early reporters, those who reported at the end of May, that actually they have beaten expectations. And so there's some sense that that's going to be positive. And when we're looking at these numbers, we're saying we know that as long as people do follow the guidelines, which is a big if in terms of social distancing, in terms of wearing masks, we are going to have some prospects of therapies in later this year in the fall. We're not that optimistic about vaccines being broadly available at the end of this year. It's much more of a 2021 issue. But so overall, when we look at the numbers, we don't think the market is at outrageously high levels at all.
Sharman, maybe the biggest headline about the markets this week was large cap tech. I mean, they're really big. The FANG stocks really drove this thing to a large degree. How broad is the increase in the markets, or how confident are the markets, or is it really just a relatively handful of companies that are driving an awful lot of this?
We actually look at a series of indicators. We do look at the advanced decline numbers. We're looking at percentage of stocks that are above versus below over the last, let's say, 10 days, 50 days, 30 days, what the moving averages are. We look at a broad range of market technicals as well. And there is some divergence. So if you're looking at growth stocks versus value stocks, if you're looking at the energy sector or financials, we actually don't think those are sectors that will drive the market, but it is not that narrow that is only the FANG stocks. The healthcare industry is actually doing very well. There are other sectors of the economy. So we think it's more broad-based than people actually acknowledge.
So Sharman, you said immediately it's because the economy does seem to be coming back perhaps faster than we thought. Let me give you an alternative explanation, which is the Fed has really taken the rates down so terribly far, and it really makes there's almost no alternative. The yield is so much worse anywhere else, as opposed to the underlying fundamentals of the economy driving it. What about that?
When we think about equity markets and equity market valuations, we look at a couple of different components. So when we look at equities, we do look at the equity risk premium, meaning looking at equity valuations versus bond valuations. So there's no doubt that such low interest rates across the board do provide some support to the equity market. But we also think the equity market is not that expensive. When you look at equities in periods of low and stable inflation like we are in right now, and we expect to be in for the foreseeable future, equity valuations are consistently higher. So relative to that environment, we're maybe 10 to 15% overvalued. That is not enough to compel us to say clients should be underweight equities. We actually recommend clients be fully invested at their strategic asset allocation. So whatever the client's risk tolerance is, that is where we recommend our clients be. So our view is that this is actually a market that is trading on fundamentals. The underlying growth is actually real. It's not just driven by the low interest rates.
What about alternatives, Sharman, to, for example, U.S. equities? And let me give you one specifically. People talk about gold or talk about bonds, things like that. What about European equities? Because if this really is a race about how to deal with the COVID-19, right now it looks like Europe's doing a better job of that than the United States.
You're quite right. You can look at all the mobility data from some of the more high-frequency sources of data, and you notice that Europe is in line with the U.S. in terms of the economy's reopening, and yet the huge spike that we have seen in the U.S. and, again, the South and the West with specific states, you're not seeing at all in Europe. And that is really a function of people not wearing masks, not following the social distancing guidelines. It's not because they have better fiscal stimulus. It's not because they have a better monetary policy. It's not because they have a better earnings outlook. In fact, if you think about what you just mentioned earlier in terms of technology stocks, information technology in aggregate is a much bigger part of the S&P 500 versus European stocks. So when we look at that, we actually at the margin do have a U.S. preeminence view. It's a view we've had now for over 10 years. When it comes to looking at European stocks, and that includes emerging market stocks as well, we do recognize that they're trading at a significant discount to their long-term averages, but we actually think that is justified. We think Europe will be much slower to grow. We think that when it comes to a coordinated policy in terms of fiscal and monetary policy, it's been a little bit harder. We already know, for example, when people have questions the ECB policy of buying bonds, whether it's legal or not legal, we don't have those issues with the Federal Reserve. And when it comes to fiscal policy, the U.S. has been much faster and much more aggressive. So when we combine the level of innovation, the role of technology, and these other policy factors in the U.S., we actually think that the U.S. is a better place to be than any overweight to Europe or emerging markets.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much, Sharman. It's really insightful and very helpful the way you're looking at it at Goldman Sachs. That's Sharman Mossavar-Rahmani. She is the Chief Investment Officer at Goldman Sachs, and she says that we should stay invested in the equity markets despite the fact that they keep pushing up, in part because the fundamentals of the economy may well justify it, and she thinks that equities really may not be overvalued after all, which is very good news in the end. Coming up, the markets are one thing, but the underlying economy could be something quite different. We talk with Glenn Hubbard, head of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush.
Sometimes we forget the stock market's not the economy. It's dominated by some very large firms, some of which have market power.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
How do we know when irrational exuberance has unduly escalated asset values, which then become subject to unexpected and prolonged contractions, as they have in Japan over the past decade? And how do we factor that assessment into monetary policy?
That was Fed Chair Alan Greenspan back in 1996 during the lead up to the tech bubble. Well, we may not have a tech bubble this time, but we certainly have a tech surge, which is helping drive the stock market overall up in the middle of a recession. Glenn Hubbard of the Columbia Business School led the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush, and he has his own perspective on whether what we're seeing today is a new version of irrational exuberance.
It's not clear. I mean, the jobless claims numbers are good news, but there's still 32.9 million people on some sort of unemployment benefit. That's 20% of the pre-COVID labor force. That's not good. So why is the stock market high? I expect there's a few factors. One, the value of stocks, of course, is the whole future of earnings. And so if you're relatively optimistic about a recovery, most of the future is still fine. Second, the Fed's interventions have pushed down the discount rate for stocks and risk spreads. And third, sometimes we forget, the stock market's not the economy. It's dominated by some very large firms, some of which have market power. So the stock market may have irrational exuberance, but it's not obvious. But even if the stock market's high, it doesn't mean the economy's fine at all.
And is it possible we'll have a second wave here on the unemployment? I mean, I don't wish that to happen, but we had United Airlines saying they may have to lay off 36,000 people. We had Boots say 4,000 people. We've got Wells Fargo saying they're going to have to lay off 1,000 people. Is it possible as you get into the second half of the year, companies are saying, how can we have this be sustainable over the long term? We have to winnow our staffs.
Well, it is, David, for two reasons. Familiar in economics, supply and demand. So on the supply side, it may be that there's just not enough activity. In other words, that people have decided not to return to traditional activities, that slows hiring and rehiring. But the others on the demand side, we could have business failures as a result and credit market problems. So policy really has to provide some insurance against this kind of outcome. And of course, the virus itself may rear its ugly head again, which puts a lot of focus on vaccines and on therapies.
And Glenn, one of the subjects that you've raised time and again is the demand issue, where there might even be demand destruction. Is there anything that we can do in a further round of stimulus or otherwise? What's the best plan to try to make sure we shore up the demand side as well as the supply side of the economy?
Well, it's a great question. I think there's two things, insurance and interconnectedness. And by insurance, I mean providing insurance that we don't fall out of bed in the economy. And by interconnectedness, realizing how businesses are interconnected. So on insurance, I would continue support for unemployment insurance, but not with the $600 additional benefit, which I think may have discouraged some people from going back to work. But there are ways to use triggers of state-level unemployment and replacement rates to provide some extra benefit, but just not quite $600. We also need to give funds to states to help make up lost revenue, to help support community colleges that are going to be critical in rebuilding and retraining people. We'll need to continue support for small and mid-sized businesses. These are things like the Federal Reserve's Main Street lending facility. And we need, finally, more support for work, what I and others have called a pandemic earned income tax credit.
Well, take us through that, because I think we're basically familiar with an earned income tax credit. How is a pandemic earned income tax credit different?
Well, you want to support low-wage work and give people reasons to go back to work. From my way of thinking, the earned income tax credit is already a strong mechanism for encouraging low-wage work. We can make it more generous. During the pandemic, we could increase its size significantly, proposed in a recent piece doubling it, but also making it available to childless workers. That is something that would really provide a boost to low-wage work when we need it, and probably a bridge to future policy, but definitely in the pandemic. Remember, unlike in the CARES Act, we're now in a phase where the economy's reopening. Our goal is to help connect people back to work, and that ought to be our mindset.
You also mentioned the unemployment insurance support, that we had this flat $600 payment. Some people are saying that might have actually encouraged, ironically, some people not to go back to work because they could make more money by being unemployed. You have come up with a proposal with Jason Furman, another former director of the Council of Economic Advisors under a different administration, where you would sort of feather that down and tie it state by state into unemployment.
Yes, in two ways, David. One would be to make it as a replacement rate of wages. You're not going to get figures as high as $600, but you'd still get extra unemployment insurance. And second, to key it off the unemployment rate in the state. So there would be triggers. If an individual state had a very high unemployment rate, these additional funds would be there. They would phase out as the unemployment rate goes down. That does a couple of things. It enables you to have a program that's robust to whatever the shape of the recovery is. We don't know sitting here today whether it's a V shape or some other shape recovery. It also avoids having to bring the Congress back to take action every time we learn something about the crisis. It puts the unemployment insurance expansion more on a trigger program linked to the economy and not to politics.
That was Wall Street Week contributor Glenn Hubbard. Coming up, rebuilding an economy in ways that address great and growing economic inequality. We hear from Wes Moore, head of the Robin Hood Foundation.
And this initiative really allows us to address poverty through the lens of this interplay that exists between racial injustice and economic injustice.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Well, it's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. As we rebuild the economy to the tune of trillions of dollars, are there ways that we can rebuild smarter? Ways that we can make sure everyone has an opportunity to participate and ultimately to succeed? Wes Moore is the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, dedicated to fighting poverty. He's also the author of a new book, 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City.
I'm a Baltimore native, and in many ways, Baltimore City helped to raise me. And one of the things that really struck me about Freddie's story was, I unfortunately have been to many funerals before my life, but his funeral was the first funeral that I'd ever been to when the person who was laying in the casket I never knew in life. And that haunted me. Because Freddie Gray's funeral was a big deal in Baltimore. But then the thing that really helped to trigger wanting to write this book and tell this story was not just the horror of his death, but in many ways the horror of his life. And that's what I wanted to uncover.
And you say, I'll just read a bit from the prologue here. You say, we had come from similar places, you and Freddie Gray, but I had been so fortunate, so blessed. And you go on to talk about your mother and your grandparents and the breaks you got along the way. How does it happen that two people with similar sorts of situations can take such divergent paths?
Well, I think that one of the things I wanted to be able to look at is when you look at the life of Freddie Gray, for so much of us, particularly for individuals, all of us, who feel like we're coming out from the margins, right? Where this wasn't always destined, that we could end up being there. There are a lot of factors that play into it, but one of the big factors that plays into it, unfortunately, is luck. It's getting a break that someone else might not get, an opportunity that someone else might not get, and the idea that we would have or can have a society that is relying on luck as a prerequisite in order for people to be able to move from one position to another position is really hard. And so it gets back to this larger point of, did Freddie Gray even have a chance? Did he even have a shot? Or was that last interaction that he had where he died and was killed in police custody for the crime of making eye contact with police, which triggered probable cause? Was that the last system to break in the life of Freddie Gray?
Well, see, that's what I found. One of the things I found very powerful in this book is, obviously, what happened with the police was inexcusable. Police officers were indicted, although I don't think they were convicted. But it was inexcusable what happened to him in that police van. But the problem with Freddie Gray started way past that. And when you talk about systems, we talk about systemic racism, systemic inequality. It's a series of systems. There's a lot of systems here that put Freddie Gray in the wrong place, and for that matter, put police in the wrong place at the same time.
That's exactly right. I mean, when you look at the life of Freddie Gray, every system failed him. The education system, when the last day of attendance that he had recorded in Baltimore City Public Schools was in 10th grade when he was 19 years old. He had been in special education developmental coursework his entire academic career because of the lead poisoning. The CDC indicates that 5 microbes of lead in every deciliter of blood is enough to give a person cognitive damage for the rest of their life. Freddie Gray had 36. And so this was a young man who from the earliest ages, from being a toddler, was going to be cognitively damaged for the rest of his life because of something he had absolutely zero to do with. And that was that the fact that the home that he was living in and the water that he was drinking was making him sick. And so when you're looking at all these various systems that then were in place and just were not in place in the life of Freddie Gray, it forces all of us to understand that this is not just going to be about policing. Reforming the police department is necessary and it is imperative. However, we also have to understand that the amount of systems and the amount of touches that Freddie Gray had in broken systems throughout led to the idea that last interaction with the broken system, with that one broken system, was just kind of a continuation of a lot of the larger life challenges that he was facing.
So as you say at the end of your book, you know, we kind of know what the problems are. There's been a lot of studies. The question is, what do you do about it? And as we turn to that question, let's first of all talk about the respective roles of philanthropy and the government and basically public policy on the one hand and the other. And you obviously are involved in a philanthropy, a very important poverty-fighting organization. Talk to us about the Power Fund.
Yeah, so we're really excited about the Power Fund. It's a new initiative that Robinhood is launching, and it's to fund and to elevate nonprofit leaders of color who share Robinhood's mission and of increasing mobility from poverty. And this initiative really allows us to address poverty through the lens of this interplay that exists between racial injustice and economic injustice, where there is a complete overlap. Because if you look at the data around poverty and you look at the data around race, you see that race is a predominant and a leading factor in every single one of our data categories. So everything from life expectancy to health to wealth and income to maternal mortality. The role that race plays is undeniable, but also when you think about philanthropy, over the past 2 decades, only around 10% of all philanthropic dollars have gone to organizations that are led by people of color. So you see that, and also on the absolute basis of the capital, it's even less. And so philanthropy, our field, we fund fewer and we fund less when it comes to organizations that are led by people of color. So the Power Fund is really seeking to expand our funding to significantly increase leaders of color-led organizations by providing self-directed leadership, capacity building, funding, and supporting this field that we know is incredibly important if we're ever going to address this issue, because the people who are closest to the challenges are oftentimes going to be the ones who are closest to the solutions.
That was Wes Moore of the Robinhood Foundation. Coming up, we hear from 2 of the governors hit worst by COVID-19, Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey and Governor Ned Lamont of Connecticut.
It's quite clear that this virus is a lot more lethal inside than it is outside. And so we are watching this minute to minute.
I listen to governors from Florida and Texas and the such saying they regret that they did open their bars when they did.
This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Does, as you say, have some catching up to do on that front. So we are expecting to see a little bit of strength coming through at the start of trade. How long will it last, though? The perennial question.
Some things you see coming. Some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. John from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. New Jersey is one of the states hardest hit by the coronavirus and most aggressive in dealing with it. After having some real success, cases are on the rise again, leaving its governor, Phil Murphy, to decide what to do next.
We made the decision based on the facts and the science to begin step-by-step reopening our state. So we knew when we were doing that, doing it responsibly, I hope at every step, that we would take on more risk in terms of increasing the potential for transmission. We were comfortable with that risk. What we were not expecting was the explosion in cases elsewhere in the country. And so the rate of transmission has gotten a little bit uncomfortably high for us, just over 1. Today it improved slightly. And so we put in with New York and Connecticut a travel advisory for folks to self-quarantine if they're coming back into our state from a hotspot. We are now requiring face coverings outdoors. Those are 2 steps that we've taken over the past 10 days or so. We've held off on indoor dining, which brings me no joy, but it's quite clear that this virus is a lot more lethal inside than it is outside. And so we're watching this minute to minute, and again, trying to make the decisions at every step based on the facts.
What are your plans at this point? To what extent are you planning on people actually being in the classroom as opposed to remote learning?
Our bias is to get kids back into the classroom. That's the starting point, but we have to do it responsibly. I think, David, the toughest nut to crack is going to be preventing the unwitting passing of the virus from an asymptomatic, young, healthy kid to an older educator or administrator or someone with underlying health challenges. So the whole notion of capacity constraints, social distancing, face coverings, lots of hyper hygiene, et cetera, doing things outdoors wherever possible. Those are all going to be elements of what we think it will look like.
There will be some things that no doubt will be statewide. Let me talk about testing. For example, are you considering requiring that every person, every instructor, every member of staff be tested before they go back to school to teach and serve the students come fall?
If we could do it, yes. We have a daily capacity right now in New Jersey that is somewhere 25 to 30,000 tests a day. Absolutely. The only obvious point to make is even if we're able to achieve that, and I think we could achieve it, this is a virus that doesn't just, it's not a one and done. We got that out of the way, check the box, we're good to go. This is an iterative reality that we're living with. And that's the only caution I would say. This is until we have therapeutics that are developed explicitly for COVID-19, certainly until we have a vaccine, we've got to keep coming back to testing and tracing and doing the right things.
I understood that, in fact, your budget is balanced through September 30. That sounds like you've got a little time to work with it.
Yeah, it's balanced because it's constitutional. It's a constitutional requirement. But in order to get our budget balanced literally only for 3+ months, David, we had to cut or defer $5.2 billion of expenses. The nut for New Jersey, we have estimated between mid this year and the end of 2021 is $20 billion. That's the amount of, that's how overwhelming this crisis has been, both in expenses that have exploded and revenues that have fallen off the table.
Are you going to have to borrow money? And if so, what does your access look like to the municipal bond market at this point? New Jersey has not always had the best credit.
Yeah, we will have to borrow money. This is not either or, it's and both. And we'll probably have to put some revenue raisers on the table as well as we develop our next budget. The first place we'll go is the Federal Reserve special program that they've set up. And that'll be the first port of call. And we'll go from there. But this is going to be and both. Borrowing, I'm sure, in the billions and needing federal cash assistance. And again, we're not alone. This is an American challenge right now. And sadly, we're seeing this virus explode around the country. The other states are in our prayers. We wish nothing but a speedy resolution. But it's a reminder that we're all in the same boat together.
Governor Murphy of New Jersey is facing a rising number of cases, but just to the north, his counterpart, Governor Ned Lamont of Connecticut has a different situation. His numbers continue to go down, but nevertheless, he is postponing further reopening because he's seen some of the difficulties his fellow governors have faced.
We've got about 95% of our economy open right now. But when it came to bars and nightclubs and big entertainment venues, I listened to governors from Florida and Texas and the such saying they regret that they did open their bars when they did. And that was an opportunity for some super spreading to go on. We don't want that to happen. So, in abundance of caution, we're not going to open them yet.
Well, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as I recall, which makes good sense. How concerned are you about people outside of Connecticut? Certainly some surrounding states, even New Jersey now seems to be ticking back up, but certainly in the South and the Southwest, there are concerns about people coming from those locations into the states up here in the Northeast. How concerned are you about that? I know you have a quarantine in place. Is that advisory, or can you enforce that?
I'm very concerned. Thankfully, we got good neighbors. Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, they have low infection rates. But you're right. If people are flying up from Miami, flying up from Houston, coming in unchecked, that's a problem. You need one or two people infected on that flight by the time it lands. Who knows what's going to happen? So we do have a quarantine in place. It is voluntary. That is true. But I'll tell you, the number of people flying into our state from those infected areas has dropped quite a bit, which is the precaution we wanted.
Governor, when you were last with us, you said that you thought perhaps the days of the routine 5-day-a-week commute from Connecticut into Manhattan may be over. What changes and patterns have you seen since then? Has that reinforced your view, or do you have a somewhat different view?
No, David, it really has reinforced our view, especially in southern Connecticut, where a lot of people would get on the train, then they get on the subway. There's a lot of reluctance about getting on the train, a lot of reluctance about getting on the subway. And I think people have found that you can have a nice suburban lifestyle, or maybe live in one of our small towns or Stamford, Connecticut. You can work out of there 2 or 3 days a week. And if you have to get into the Big Apple to take care of business, you could do that, but you don't have to live there.
What longer-term changes besides the commuting issue you just raised are you taking a look at right now? I'll give you another example. There are a lot of reports of people in Manhattan looking for houses up in Greenwich, up in southern Connecticut, and out in New Jersey. And what's going on with the real estate market right now?
The real estate market is very, very busy. People coming from New York, people coming from Boston. I think if they feel like this may not be the end of the end when it comes to the nature of self-quarantining, if you have a house with a little backyard, or you can get a couple of extra rooms at less cost than perhaps Brooklyn, it's a pretty good place to be. So I think you're going to see a dynamic change. Let's face it, for the last 20 years, young people wanted to be in the major metro centers. Now I think there'll be a little balancing out.
That was Governor Ned Lamont of Connecticut. Coming up, the roundtable comes back to Wall Street Week. We talk with contributor Larry Summers of Harvard and former Fed Governor Dan Tarullo, also of Harvard. This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg. economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic has come in fits and starts. The Fed has taken unprecedented steps to prop up the U.S. economy since its emergency meeting on March 15. The central bank slashed the Fed funds rate to zero and announced an immediate and unlimited quantitative easing program.
While the primary response to this challenge will come from our healthcare providers and policy experts, economic policymakers must do what we can to ease hardship caused by the disruptions to the economy and to support a swift return to normal.
On March 23rd, the Fed announced a sweeping set of measures, including 3 new emergency lending facilities to support up to $300 billion in new financing for firms.
I do think that the confidence provided by the Fed has allowed more normalized markets to return and to get a real two-way flow in markets that are just fundamental to the support of our economy.
On April 6th, the Fed unveiled its Main Street Business Lending Program under the authority granted to it under the CARES Act. The Fed pledged to extend $600 billion in credit to small businesses and expanded the program at the end of April.
On Main Street and frankly on all of the other facilities, we expect all of them to be stood up and ready to go by the end of this month. I don't say that it won't be a day or two into June.
The Main Street Lending Program went into effect on June 15th, but has struggled to drum up interest. Of the biggest U.S. banks, only Bank of America has agreed to use the program to lend to new customers. As coronavirus cases surge in several states, the path of the economic recovery looks uncertain.
People are getting nervous again. Business leaders are getting worried. Consumers are getting worried. And there's a real sense that this might go on longer than we had hoped.
Now, the Fed's monetary policy tools could be coming up against their limits.
They're doing everything they can. They're doing everything they should. I applaud them in the fog of war to have been so coherent and so quick off the block. But I think it can't go on forever.
The central bank could join some of its global peers to cut rates below zero, but the Fed is holding off on such a drastic measure.
The jury's out as to how effective they've been and whether they've actually helped growth.
And now to talk about what the Fed has done, what it should do, what it can do, I'm delighted to say we're going to reintroduce our roundtable discussion. A little different in the time of COVID. We aren't sitting around a table physically, but virtually we'll do it. And we have with us Larry Summers, our special contributor we have with us every week, of Harvard, former Treasury Secretary, and also Dan Tarullo, former Federal Reserve Governor, now also up at Harvard at the law school. So, Dan, let me start with you because you've been in the room in some very difficult times at the Fed. And let me go to the real heart of it. Every time we hear from Jay Powell, he says, you know, the Fed, we only lend. We don't grant. Are they close to going over that line at this point? Because they're making some loans. I'm not sure that they'll get repaid.
Well, David, remember, the constraint on the Fed is that when they stand up an extraordinary facility under their authority of Section 13.3, they're not supposed to lose money on the facility. A particular loan can go bad and still have the facility protected. And that's the reason why the Treasury Department puts in what's the equivalent of equity in order to absorb any losses that may come. But the broader issue you raise is one of whether the Fed should be in the business of making quasi-grants. And I think that's what's really being debated right now, because one of the reasons why the Main Street facility is not being used is that at least at this time, mid-sized companies that need credit, genuine credit, can get a hold of that credit. And so at this moment, the mid-sized companies that are struggling probably need something that looks a little bit closer to equity than it does to credit. And that, as Jay Powell continues to say, is not at least at present understood to be part of the Fed's mandate.
So Larry Summers, what about from your perspective? Has the Fed done everything it can do? And is it possible it's gone too far, going into quasi-grants, as Dan says, as opposed to just loans?
I think in the fullness of it all, the Fed should get high grades for its boldness. I think it's recognized that in crises like this, there's more to fear from doing too little than there is to fear from doing too much. I worry, though, that a Fed-first strategy is a financial markets first strategy. And I'd rather see us put a little more effort into ensuring the economy and a little less effort into insuring the markets. The big gaps are about to loom with respect to fiscal stimulus if Congress doesn't get moving and pass a follow-on to the various CARES Act provisions that are expiring at the end of July. I think Jay Powell's right to be careful about involving the Fed too much in basic political decisions about the allocation of credit. You know, here's an analogy that helps me at least think about it. There probably are people who think that if the Supreme Court would get involved in adjudicating the issues around police behavior, they'd do a better job than anybody else. There are probably people who think they have credibility beyond what other people have. There are probably people who would rather not take political responsibility for it and would like to offload that task on the Supreme Court. But I think if somebody tried, the Supreme Court would resist, because it would recognize that in a long run sense, becoming so involved with politics would corrode its role. And I think that's the kind of challenge that the Fed faces. And I think all things considered, Jay has navigated pretty well, but his errors certainly have not been of being too passive.
Yeah, it's a really great point of the Supreme Court. Having worked there a while ago now, I'll tell you, the Supreme Court is concerned about its political capital, and you go out on a limb there, and it could get really sawed off behind it. But Dan, Larry raises a really good point. The Fed clearly has the ability to get asset values up. Does it really have the ability to affect the underlying economy and get it growing?
So I think, David, there are a few things here. First, there's the institutional role, which Larry just alluded to. You know, whether or not the Fed could, within its legal mandate, actually begin to provide real economy kind of funding is one question. The other question is whether it's desirable for them to do that. And, you know, just as we've seen the debates already as to whether the Fed should be supporting companies that don't maintain a certain percentage of their pre-COVID employment, just as we've seen the Bank of England now coming under pressure not to provide credit to companies that have not committed to a zero admissions target. I think those kind of political issues are definitely going to affect the Fed if it tries to get deeper into this business. And I think Powell and the rest of the board are very much aware of that. But then you've got the additional issue of, even if the Fed were willing to do it, and even if it could manage legally to do it within the Federal Reserve Act's mandate, does it really have the technical capacity to do it? I mean, the Fed has bank examiners and bank supervisors who are pretty good at making sure that banks don't overextend themselves, but they don't have people who are experienced in, and they don't have the numbers that would be necessary to make the kinds of judgments that really are needed if you're trying to decide, for example, will this company have a good prospect in a year if only it can make it through the COVID problem now? So I think there are legal issues, there are institutional issues, and as Larry was mentioning a moment ago, there's also a political responsibility question here, because ultimately it really is the responsibility of the Congress to make these choices.
And that's the issue we're going to take up next with this roundtable. Really, what are the political issues? What is fiscal stimulus supposed to look like? Bearing in mind, we just heard part of the plan for the economy from Joe Biden this week. So that's coming up next with our roundtable with Larry Summers and Dan Tarullo. This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear It wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. This is Wall Street Week, and I'm David Weston. We are back now with our roundtable. Dan Tarullo, former Fed governor, and also Larry Summers, special contributor for Wall Street Week and former Treasury Secretary. So, Larry, we've been talking about the Fed. As you've suggested, there's a lot more to economic policy than that. But give us a sense, as somebody who's done this, who's really set economic policy, how do you set an economic policy given all the uncertainty we have of the pandemic, of what's going on with the recession, and even some of the racial injustice issues?
Well, look, I think during the Mexican crisis 25 years ago, President Zedillo said something that has always stuck with me. He said, markets tend to overreact, which is a reason why policy should overreact. And so I think the errors are much more likely to be of acting insufficiently boldly than they are of acting too boldly. I think we need a bold set of inclusive growth measures. This is not the time for thinking about and focusing on austerity. This is not the time for worrying about excesses of government activity. This is a time when we need to do much more. First, to put the public COVID crisis behind us. We need much larger investments in testing and contact tracing so we can perform like the European countries rather than the uniquely bad performance we're delivering. Second, we need to pivot to an aggressive government program that can absorb private savings, the excess of private savings and the consequent stagnation and low interest rates being our principal macroeconomic problem, and absorb it by doing things that are fundamentally socially important, putting people to work on repairing the nation's infrastructure, making our education system work effectively and be adequately resourced, channeling capital to the most depressed parts of our country. There's an idea that somehow we can't promote fairness without hurting business. And I think exactly the opposite is the case. And I think enlightened business leaders are increasingly recognizing that if we don't do some things to promote fairness in society, it's all going to come crashing down around them.
Well, Larry, let me put that question specifically to Dan. Is there a trade-off or is it a misperception between increased economic fairness on the one hand and economic growth on the other?
Well, there doesn't seem to be any reason why there needs to be such a trade-off. I mean, after all, to the degree that one increases sustained aggregate demand of the sort that you get when people have money to spend, that should be good for business. And with the reduced share that labor has had of the nation's product in the last couple of decades, obviously you don't have that kind of spending. So there may be, and I think there is perhaps some conflict between taxation rates and more fairness. But I agree, there's no necessary trade-off between growth and fairness. And there's no reason why good progressive economic policy cannot take into account market considerations. There's no need to be a market fundamentalist.
I mean, let's be clear. The business community would have been thrilled 3 years ago if they had gotten the corporate rate down into the mid-high 20s. 21 was something that the business community was not even asking for. Let's be clear. The best performance of the U.S. economy took, in terms of growth and per capita growth, took place in the 50s and 60s when top tax rates were much higher than they are now.
And that, and that is no doubt why Joe Biden is suggesting 28% instead. I want to thank our roundtable very much, Larry Summers and Dan Tarullo. Great to have you both back with us. We'll keep working on this roundtable. It's a work in progress, as it is for all of us working from home, but it's terrific to have the roundtable back up and going. Finally, one more thought. Back to school. It was the subject of much conversation this week, with President Trump insisting that the schools be up and running come September.
Very importantly, we're safely reopening our schools. We want the schools to be open and going in the fall.
While state and local officials struggle with exactly what that might mean, including the possibility of a hybrid of in-class and remote learning.
When we know that health and safety means social distancing, therefore we have to use a lot more space for fewer kids, it makes very clear the approach we will use is blended learning.
But the Trump administration doesn't like to do things halfway, so it surprised everyone this week when it announced that remote learning isn't good enough, at least when it comes to college and graduate students, and at least where those students come from overseas, leaving thousands of those students to wonder whether they can get the visas they need to continue their education in this country, and leaving the rest of us to wonder why, if it isn't good enough for students from abroad, it is good enough for American school children. That does it for this episode of Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. This is Bloomberg. See you next week.
Yet another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television. Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
True diversification. That's what adding commodities exposure to your stock and bond portfolio can help provide. The Bloomberg Commodity Index is the standard for commodity market exposure. 23 traded commodities are represented: agriculture, livestock, metals, and energy. The Bloomberg Commodity Index is the benchmark most widely used by investment professionals globally. Track your commodity investments with a proven financial information partner. The Bloomberg Commodity Index. True diversification.
James and Maverick Carter are boyhood friends turned business partners, and in March, they put together their most ambitious deal yet.
When we talk about storytelling, we want to be able to hit home.
Launching a new media empire called the Spring Hill Company, James and Carter have become new generation content players. advising companies how to reach people of color, leveraging the name, connections, and principles of the world's most famous sports star.
It's our mission and my duty as an individual and as working at the Spring Hill Company to give people exposure.
But since March, the ground under James and Carter's project has shifted, with the pandemic putting the NBA season on hold and protests forcing America to confront issues of racial injustice. I spoke with LeBron James and Maverick Carter in person in February, and in June I connected with them again on Zoom in their first interview since the world locked down due to COVID-19 to get their thoughts on what's been taking place in the streets.
In the case of George Floyd, in the case of so many other innocent lives being taken away, they've put up a stand, and now, we're being heard.
Join us for a special Bloomberg Business Week, a conversation with LeBron James and Maverick Carter. Welcome to a special edition of Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Jason Kelly in New York. This week's cover story, the King and the CEO. I sat down with LeBron James and Maverick Carter at the Lakers practice facility in California in February. None of us knew then how the world was about to change. They were excited to announce a big deal, and it's still a big deal. On March 11th, the same day the NBA suspended its season, and a little more than a week before LA went into lockdown, they formed the Spring Hill Company. It's a media venture and more, raising $100 million.
Well, it allows us to grow, and that's one of the number one things, but more for us to continue to empower people, continue to empower the athlete, continue to empower, storytelling, continue to empower, so many great minds that we have that we've been able to gain over these years in order to build this company.
As this deal comes together, as what we want to continue to do with the Spring Hill Company and Uninterrupted is to take creators, people with fantastic minds, amazing stories that care about the communities and people in places that we come from, that we care about, that we know. We're going to lean in to that community and really tell stories that matter to them, create experiences and products that matter to those people, because we really care about those people. We know how they feel in this time, as you said, in 2020, people want to feel empowered. I feel like it's our mission and my duty as an individual and as working at the Spring Hill Company to give people exposure, give people experiences, give them stories that make them actually feel something that is more than they felt before they walked into an experience that we gave them, whether it be storytelling or a product.
There are a lot of athletes who choose to keep their sport as their platform, what they do on the court. You have markedly chosen not to do that. Why did you make that decision?
At the end of the day, to each his own. But for me, coming from where I come from and knowing my upbringing and seeing the statistics for guys like myself, not only males, but also females, being underprivileged, and not having the resources to be able to make it out of your situation. And for me and for Maverick and for all of us, the guys that I grew up with, for us to be able to make it out of that situation, I felt like it was only right and a responsibility for me to give back those resources that I've gained along the way to the youth and to the kids that's growing up, behind me, to let them understand and let them know that you can also make it out as well.
Right.
It was something that I didn't choose. It chose me.
Right.
It chose me. And once I felt that, I was like, okay, this is my responsibility to know that I have to continue to empower the people, not only in my community, but all over the world as well.
Right. Well, also, it's the platform, but also it's when you grow up like LeBron and I did, it's more than anything, honestly, it's the exposure.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you grow up in a place like we are, no matter how talented you are, no matter how good you are at something, and you believe it, if you don't even know things exist, and you're not exposed to them, then there's no way for you to ever even feel empowered, because you're like, I'm confined to this small world.
Well, I would say that it all stems from my upbringing. It all stemmed from Akron. It all stemmed from all these people that we've met along the way that grow up in similar situations. And for us, when we talk about storytelling, we want to be able to hit a lot of homes where they feel like they can be just as part of that story, or they feel like, oh, you know what, I can relate to that story because I am someone that's going through that same situation. But as far as what we do, it's very organic to to our upbringing.
And that seems to be at the core of what you're trying to do with this company, Maverick. Is that fair?
Well, I would say at the core of the company is a mission, and it's about empowering greatness to every individual around the world through entertainment, content, products, and experiences. And that mission is and that vision is the company that we want to build. And then we build products, whether they be content, events, experiences, apparel, that fits that mission instead of the other way around, which a lot of companies build products and then write a mission, right? We're a company with a mission.
Coming up, my second and latest conversation with LeBron James and Maverick Carter. They speak frankly about the powerful wave of protests sweeping across America and NBA's return to play. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
When everything around us, including the way we work and live, has been interrupted, uninterrupted service is peace of mind. Juzi from customer support is responding to a 500% increase in daily call volume, no matter what. We keep on, so you can keep on.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Welcome back to a special edition of Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Jason Kelly. This week's cover story, a conversation with LeBron James and Maverick Carter. While I sat down with the duo in California in February, it's clearly a very different world today. Of course, James and Carter didn't plan to introduce this new company at this time. The blacks are dying from COVID at more than twice the rate of whites, and a recession in which black unemployment numbers have climbed to their highest level in more than a decade, or at a time when a historic wave of protests are sweeping the country and the world. I caught up with them recently via Zoom.
We've been through a lot, this year. You look at the death of Kobe Bryant that we had to deal with, and obviously, our prayers are still with Vanessa and the two daughters that's here. So, that was a tragic moment for us. You come to the point where the playoffs are almost around the corner, and then, it stopped because of a world pandemic and COVID-19. So, we just all had to be at bay and just kind of wait around and see what was going on and see what was happening, but understanding that the health of every individual is so much more important at that point in time than worrying about, chasing a ring or chasing a championship, because there were lives at risk, and no one had an answer to it. and then bring us up to speed to the George Floyd killing, and just seeing that video and seeing, how many people were hurt, not only in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, but all over the world, and especially in the Black community, because we've seen this over and over and over, about police brutality and the things that goes on in the inner city when being, racially profiled as an African American Black man or as a Black woman, and things that's going on. So, it's been a lot that's going on in 2020.
Is this a moment, a special moment, and an important moment for activism in your mind?
Activism and activists have always been around, but people had a closed ear and a closed mind, and didn't want to recognize, and didn't want to hear, and didn't want to be knowledgeable about what they were speaking, where they were coming from, the passion that they were speaking with. Now it's being heard. People can be heard. Black Americans, African Americans, can be heard. Both men and women can be heard of what they're passionate about, and the calling for help, and the calling for we're just tired. So, I don't want to say activism is something that's now everyone's doing it. No, it's always been around. But in the case of George Floyd, in the case of so many other innocent lives being taken away, they've put up a stand, and now we're being heard, and everyone is being heard. Not only from what Muhammad Ali was saying, there's so many that came before him and so many after him, but even the local people, the people in the community, because those are the real ones, the people that's in the communities, that's living and walking those streets, and being racially profiled and being judged every day that they walk in their cities. They're the ones that need to be heard, and they're being heard right now, and it's great to see.
And LeBron, we move from that to More Than a Vote that was launched officially this week. What does success look like for More Than a Vote as you look toward November?
I think success looks like educating the people that's on the grounds in these cities that we're tackling. We've had voter suppression for so long. People not understanding how they can vote, where they can vote, if their vote really counts. In the Black community, you always hear go out and vote, but what you don't understand is, who am I voting for? Where can I vote? How many people am I voting for? What does these votes mean? What do they stand for? So the education side is what we're most proud about.
And Maverick, I do wonder, to speak to this moment where we are, given that you were positioned to do this via Spring Hill, what are the conversations that are incoming to you, whether it's from studios, whether it's from CEOs of companies? Are your calls getting returned more? Or is there more interest in what you're doing, given that the world does seem to be moving in this moment?
Yeah, and you keep calling it a moment. Hopefully it's not just a moment, right? I don't want to call it a moment. This is what's needed. This is actually more like what this country should be and what this world should be. So it's not a moment. It doesn't feel at all like a moment to me. As I said, I've been Black my whole life, right? So and pushing to empower all people, and specifically Black people, my whole life. We've always been about empowering people who feel like us and come from the communities that we come from and want to believe in our mission. And the content we've created, who we've created that content with, has always been about that. It's obviously a bit magnified now. We're getting some external calls that, hey, if you guys have ideas that want to help us, sure. And me personally, I am getting a lot of calls from people, other CEOs. When I've also got a lot of calls on, what are you doing? What do you think? What do you think we should be doing? So I'm taking those all in stride and explaining to people, as I just said to you, that, hey, don't treat this as a moment. This isn't a moment. This is what you should have been doing all along. And this is what everyone needs to be doing going forward anyway.
And so, LeBron, to that point, what can you do, given your stature, to ensure that this isn't fleeting? What are the things that we need to be doing and thinking about? What can you do to really take this forward in many ways? What are you thinking about?
I will continue to point out things that I know is wrong. If I see it, not only socially, but also with cameras in my face. And I will also continue to lead by example as a model citizen, as a Black man growing up in America. So my mission stays the same.
LeBron, I do wonder, I think back to 2014 and Eric Garner and the T-shirt that you wore, and the NBA has consistently stood behind you and its players in terms of protest. Other leagues have not done that, most notably the NFL. Now the NFL has changed its tune. What do you make of that?
I do know one thing I can speak from is what I'm a part of. And I'm a part of a league with a great commissioner in Adam Silver, and he's always listened to the voice of his players. And I've always respected him for that. He's given us an opportunity to, when we feel something that's very wrong with society, that's very wrong with what's going on in our communities, that we can speak upon that and use the NBA shield to back us. And I have nothing but respect for Adam Silver. As far as the NFL, I'm not in those locker rooms. I'm not with those guys, but I do understand that an apology, I have not heard a true official apology to Colin Kaepernick on what he was going through and what he was trying to tell the NFL and tell the world about why he was kneeling when he was doing that as a San Francisco 49er. So I just see that to still be wrong. And now they are listening some, but I still think we have not heard that official apology to a man who basically sacrificed everything for the better of this world. So I can say that about that.
So when you think about what happens next from an NBA perspective, LeBron, assuming that everything stays the same, you're to be playing basketball pretty soon, which feels like good news for a lot of folks. And I would imagine, especially you, given the position the Lakers were in going into all this. Kyrie Irving has said, and I believe you have disagreed, that maybe you should think about not playing. What do you think?
You know, for us to be together as a league once again, along what's going on right now, it gives us another opportunity to continue to talk about what's going on, the social injustice, the police brutality, Black Lives Matter, and continue to hit home on things that's going on that matters a lot as well. But sports has always been something that kind of galvanized and brought people together and just make people feel, very uplifted. And I know in my community right now, we just, unfortunately, a beautiful 18-year-old girl by the name of Nakia Crawford was just gunned down in Akron, Ohio last week, a week after graduating high school. Just to get people's minds, not saying forget about certain situations, but to just have a breath of fresh air, to have a sense of love, what sports can bring. And I know what I do on the basketball court can bring a lot of happiness to a lot of households, including my own, and including my community and my kids. So I'm looking forward to the season getting restarted, getting back in the Laker uniform, and continue to push the envelope, not only on the court, but off the court, because like I've been telling a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my friends, I won't stop until I see change. And I mean real change for us as a community, as a Black community, both on and off the floor. So my mission stays the same.
Up next, their brand is global and their goals are big. LeBron James and Maverick Carter talk about facing controversy in China and building a legacy beyond basketball. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
as you say, have some catching up to do on that front. So we are expecting to see a little bit of strength coming through at the start of trade. How long will it last, though? The perennial question.
Welcome back to a special edition of Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Jason Kelly. Well, it's this week's cover story, my conversation with LeBron James and Maverick Carter. James's More Than a Vote group has been called hypocritical by some, claiming his position didn't align with his past comments, specifically when James called basketball executive Daryl Morey's support for Hong Kong protesters, quote, misinformed. When I sat down with them in February, I asked LeBron what he learned from that experience.
Best teacher in life experience, and you know how to handle it the next time, or handle it if there's another situation. So for me, I'm learning every single day.
And what'd you learn from that?
Just continue to get better.
Yeah.
Continue to get better. And if you keep yourself at bay and you don't keep an open mind about how to continue to get better, then I think you're failing yourself.
But it's not going to prevent you from speaking out, I'm guessing, and going forward.
No. I would be cheating. I would be cheating myself and the people that follow me. That's for sure.
I read something where you mentioned that someone that you admire historically was Muhammad Ali. Why?
I mean, we'd be sitting here for 3 hours.
Yeah.
Why?
But what do you?
Because
what do you take from his experience? Because I think part of the context of the quote was he did, some percentage of good for the world by his sport, but so much was beyond the ring.
Because at the end of the day, it wasn't just everyone was so fascinated how great of a boxer he was. I think that was the least thing in his mind. I think every day he was trying to figure out how he can better the world and better the people around him and make a change for the greater of good. And like I said, no matter if people agree with him or not.
Right.
I think 80-90% of people didn't agree with anything that he did back when he was doing it. But that didn't stop him. He stayed focused on his mission. And that's what we're talking about, like the mission. What is your mission? And there's going to be people that's going to agree with you on that time. There's going to be people that don't agree. More than likely, it's going to be more than half that don't agree. But you can't allow that to stop your mission. Like, what is your mission? And for Ali to be able to do the things that he did in the time that he did as well, being African American during those times, it doesn't matter. And the fact that we can see it and it was captured,
right,
and we can watch it and see it and read about it and things of that nature, I don't think we deserve it.
Right. This notion of empowerment, and Mav alluded to this at the top of the conversation, you've been a leading voice in that. You've changed the NBA in a lot of ways. You've changed the dynamic between players and coaches and even players and owners. Why do you think that happened? What was the sort of moment, or was it just a natural evolution of who you are?
I don't know. I don't look at it like that. I look at it as I make my decisions based upon me and my career and my family. And if it's changed the landscape of something, then hopefully for the greater good.
Yeah,
hopefully for the greater good, because I only want the game to be great while I'm in it and even better off when I leave it. So hopefully that the decisions that I've made along my career, hopefully it's bettered the game, and it also inspired, the guys that come, after me to continue to make this game the greatest game in the world, in my opinion. So.
But we have seen an evolution, it feels like. Maverick, maybe it's more comfortable for you to talk about LeBron's impact there. I mean, the NBA, by many accounts, has changed more dramatically than other professional sports, largely driven by the prominence of certain athletes and the athletes' ability to be bigger than the game. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I would say part of it is just the natural evolution of life and the game of basketball. And a big part of it is the people involved, all the people involved, from the late, great David Stern to Magic and Larry, and to the brands that are involved in basketball, right? All the brands that are involved in basketball and in the NBA, now to Adam Silver, to up to players like LeBron and new owners. I think it's been mostly just a natural evolution, but also the people who are at the top of the sport, the superstars like LeBron, people like Adam Silver, being okay with change and pushing the envelope a bit has been a big reason. I think, you know, no player is bigger than the game. The game of basketball is obviously a global sport. It's big business. And the NBA goes on, right? Lots of players come and go, and the NBA keeps going on. But I think, to your question, LeBron, the point, and LeBron's point is, while he's an NBA player and he's been playing for a long time and got who knows how long, much longer to play, is while he's playing to have the greatest impact he can to push it forward, to leave it in a better place for the next athletes that are coming in. And then it's their job. Then it's their turn. They have to do it as a player. And if LeBron becomes an owner or whatever he decides to do, he can do it from a different angle, right?
Maverick opened the door as well. Do you want to own a team someday?
It would be great.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be great. I just want to stay around the game. I love the game of basketball. It's given so much to me, and if it's a possible chance that I could to own a team or you know, obviously be a part of a team, that would be amazing. So we shall see.
And that wraps up our Bloomberg Business Week special edition, my conversation with LeBron James and Maverick Carter. You can read the cover story. It's available on newsstands now, also online at businessweek.com and through our mobile app. And check out Bloomberg Business Week Radio. It's on SiriusXM channel 119, AM 1130 in New York, 1061 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C., AM 960 in the Bay Area, and in London on DAB Digital, and of course through the Bloomberg Business app. I'm Jason Kelly. More Bloomberg Television starts right now.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
The national security bill was passed by Chinese lawmakers. The Hong Kong police force has already acted in accordance with the new law.
It's a very disturbing development.
This is, in effect, an attempt to end one country, two systems.
The central government is telling us just stay out of politics.
Red-soled shoes, an icon of fashion around the world, and signature of the French designer Christian Louboutin. A staple of the runway, they've also taken over popular culture, from Sex and the City to the world's biggest stars. Born in 1963 in Paris's 12th arrondissement with three sisters, fashion was Christian's calling. As a teenager, he traveled to Egypt and India, returning to Paris with a portfolio full of sketches. In 1991, he opened his first store in the capital, growing the brand to 150 boutiques around the globe. And it's not just shoes, he's expanded into purses, wallets, cosmetics, and fragrances. Today, on Leaders with Lacroix, we meet Christian Louboutin. Christian Louboutin, thank you so much for joining us on Leaders with Lacroix. What do you see yourself as? Artist, creative, or shoemaker?
Well, first, I'm really a shoemaker. And then after, I would say I consider myself as an artisan, a luxury artisan. Artist, definitely no, I wouldn't say that.
So do you remember the first time where you decided that shoes would be your trade?
Well, this is a long time ago because I've been starting designing shoes when I was probably around 10, 11, 12 or something like that, around these days. And so, which is more than 40 years. But I remember starting to sketch shoes, not thinking that it would actually be a job, but it was more of a hobby. And then I remember the moment where I thought, wow, that could actually be a nice job to do. And that was years after.
Why shoes?
Shoes, because I always wanted, one of the first things that I always loved was showgirls, musical, and cinema, and theater. But one of the things that I was born and raised in Paris, and the thing that I was doing with my best friend from school when I was 12, 13, 14, is to go to see shows in Paris, second act, because in general, when you see a show in Paris, there is a second act, but between the first act and second act, you go outside and then you come back and nobody's asking for your ticket. So with my friend Tuan, we were like, okay, sneaking to second act. And so we've been seeing every single plays, every single shows possible. And my favorite thing was to actually see musical, especially when, you see a play, the second part of the play, you haven't been to the first part. You sort of don't know. It takes a while to sort of understand and to fabricate the story, understand the characters, etc., which is great. For the brain, it's actually a very, very good thing. But when you're a bit tired or if you just want to have fun, musical was easier. So my favorite thing was always that. So I wanted to do something. I wanted to do something for these girls and the musical girls. And so I thought just shoes, because I was seeing them like a little bit like birds of paradise, exotic birds with all the fur, etc. So the only thing is that, birds don't have shoes, and I could see that they had shoes. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do shoes for these birds. So really my first thing was to design shoes for dancers, musical dancers, dancers in general, performers.
And then when did you have the idea of putting the red sole on them?
That's much after. So I started to work for showgirls, and then I started to work in the fashion industry, and then I started my company in 91, the end of 91, and the red sole arrived in 93, quite quickly after I started to do my company, actually.
Okay, so why do you think you're so successful when many of your competitors have not been?
It's a difficult question to answer to, but I would say that I'm coming from a family strong with women. I have 3 older sisters. I had a lovely mother and no brothers. So I was really the only male, if one can say, figure apart from my father. And so I was really brought up almost like in a harem with a lot of women. So I think that from an early age, I've been very, not confronted because it's not, but I've been very at ease in the company of women, and I know women very well. So my work is dedicated to women with the biggest respect and the love that I have for all of them. So I guess that's one thing which has been important in my story.
Okay, so when you first started with that red sole, did something happen? Did it become more desirable? I mean, that's really what you've been known for so many years.
Well, the red sole has transformed my, let's say, my work as a club in a way. I remember people in 93, 94, women were coming to me and saying, we make part of this little club, and sometimes we just do this, and then people do understand, etc. And then after, so it was a little bit of a club at the beginning, and then it became very quickly a sign of recognition of my shoes, and then it became a trademark. But it's been, little by little in a way.
Do you think you would have been so successful without the red sole?
I think the red sole definitely, of course, participates to my work, but also to the fame of my shoes, because it's instantly recognizable. But then, the design is very important. But definitely, when you have such a strong sign of recognition, it participates to your work. Yeah.
I mean, the business is quite incredible because you're never on sale. None of your items are ever on sale.
Mm-hmm.
The wholesale is held very tightly, I would say. Is that part of your success?
I think that, you know, when you do something which is luxury, you have to be careful and you have to treat everything in that way, you know. So you're not bargaining things, you're not throwing things, etc. It needs to be well done. I have people taking care of that seriously, and yes, you have to be serious with what you do.
Coming up, Christian Louboutin on the legal fight over the red souls.
To have to fight people who have those huge companies who put you 27 lawyers on your back for something which is yours is very stressful.
Groundbreaking, yet simplistic. Christian Louboutin first designed his trademark shoe in 1993, creating the red bottom using an assistant's nail polish. And after a legal fight, Europe's highest court ruled he has a right to trademark the look, protecting his designs from imitators. But how do you come up with such a landmark design, and what kind of innovation does it take to rise to the top of the fashion industry? At some point you had to fight for the trademark, right, for the red sole.
Yeah.
Was that stressful?
Very stressful, very stressful. Especially, you know, we are a small company in a way, and to have to fight people who have those huge companies who put you 27 lawyers on your back for something which is yours is very stressful. I mean, I wish I wish it didn't happen. Everything which happened to me is a lesson in a way, bad or good, and once it's done, and you're sort of happy. I mean, I'm happy about it. That thing I could have definitely avoided, but it's done.
Did you realize at the time when you started the company that you would become so successful and actually so big?
No. You know, when I started the company, I wanted to have a shop in Paris, which is my hometown, and I wanted to do pretty shoes for pretty girls. That was my goal.
And now you look back and you say, actually, I still make pretty shoes, but for many more women.
Yeah, absolutely.
But have you changed as a person, as a creative?
I think that, you know, work makes you change, and everybody changes, you know. You get 10 years after, hopefully you've been changing, but deep, no, nothing changed. I mean, nothing changed. My work is I work with a maximum of passion and enthusiasm, and this has completely stayed. And so that's been the most important thing. And again, the most important part of my work is to design shoes, and I keep that momentum, several times a year, and that's really the most important thing. So all of this structure has remained the same. Then yes, the company grew, so it's a different story. We have a lot of people now working, etc., different offices in different places. So the structure has changed, but really sort of me, the way I'm working. I had a Vespa when I started. Okay, it got stolen. I had another Vespa, but I'm still on my Vespa in Paris. So things really, really important things to sort of maintain, put you grounded, hasn't changed.
But you have more than 150 stores around the world. How difficult is it to make sure that each is representative of you and what you want it to be?
There is one thing, I always loved to travel. Always did travel a lot, intensely, and always loved to travel. So when, for instance, talking of the shops that we have in the world, when the collection is set up, I look at the collection and I sort of see some shoes and I'm thinking, this is going to be very nice in these colors, etc. It promises me to keep on actually flying to different countries immediately, thinking, the collection is vast. So basically you take a part of the collection and it will go in Asia. That part will go more like in hot countries, sandals, This place is more for like fixed cities in America. It sort of depends. The whole collection sort of is global, but then after you detach some of the things and there and there and there. So it promises me to actually, to keep on traveling. So it's a nice way to, so basically what I'm saying is that I'm editing the collection.
Yeah.
I don't do shoes thinking special markets or things like that. My design is free. But then after, when it's editions, and suddenly it's actually funny to think of where it's going to go.
But you're also very involved in some of the shops. In Miami, for example, you actually put there some old columns that you'd found elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm involved in the construction of the shop. Every shop has also a feeling of the city where it is, or also things from the city, or things that as a French person I think is a reference to a city or to a culture or to a country. So yeah, I'm definitely involved. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm a frustrated decorator because I'm not frustrated. I decorate my own houses, so it's all fine. But I love objects. I've always been collecting things. So I have things that I buy anywhere I am, where I am, and then I store them and I wait that it goes to a place. So for instance, those columns, I've been buying those columns, which are in fibre de verre, glass fiberglass, and I've been having this column for probably 20 years. And Miami store has been there for less than 4 years, something like that. So I've been having them, and I'm tenacious. I knew that it would go in a perfect place at one point, at some point. And now it is, yeah.
Are you close to your customers?
Yeah. The first, I'm easily close to my customer in the sense of for the two first years, so 92 and 93, I was selling in the store. So I was selling in my first store in Paris. So when I was not in Italy where the shoes were made, I was always in the store. So I sort of understood that, at the very end, everything is dedicated to one person, which is your client. So I always love to speak to my clients, especially the first year when nobody knew that I was also the designer. I was a very good salesman, and nobody knew that the salesman was a designer. So it was very interesting to see why people would favor this versus that, etc.
When I was speaking to your team, I asked them, actually tell me something that we don't know about Christian Louboutin. And they said, well, one of the things is that, sometimes he goes to sign things, either shoes or things like that, and customers get really emotional. Why do you think there's this emotional attachment?
I think that shoes, for some reason, I'm doing different things, the leather goods, bag, etc. I've been taking care of beauty industry, but shoes is really my core thing, and shoes has a very strong link with intimacy. And so, for instance, when I'm signing shoes of clients, they often start to speak, their first shoes. And I remember this woman told me, you remember in your life, everybody remembers where they were when Michael Jackson died, 9/11, you have things. And she says, me, I have all these dates, but I also remember the first time I wore a pair of your shoes. And I was very, 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 very emotionally taken by that, because I could understand that, you know, it's important. So I see a lot of women are quite attached to what it means, the symbol it gives to them, the empowerment it gives to them, or the first moment, or, you know, what the relationship that they have, which their own intimacy in a way.
Coming up, on branching out from shoes, Christian Louboutin talks the challenges involved in expanding his brand.
I'm conscious that if you want to do your job well, you have to concentrate, and I cannot spread myself everywhere all the time.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Art, a painting, a sculpture, maybe even shoes. This year, Paris, Palais de la Porte Dorée, opened an exhibition dedicated to Christian Louboutin's iconic designs called L'Exhibitionniste. A pair of his stilettos have even been on display at the New York's Met. But just like any other artist, to produce a new work, he needs inspiration. So where does he find it? And what does he say to critics of his high heels?
There's an exhibition in Paris dedicated to you.
Yeah.
What does it make you feel? What do you want people to get out of it?
You know, it's the exhibition, which is now. It started at the 25th of February. So the exhibition is around my work, and it's a celebration, let's say, of my work, but also a celebration of collaboration and work that I've been doing with other people. So I'm including artists, I'm including artisans there, and artists and artisans really. And then also it's a celebration of, let's say, different influences that I could have had, that I'm having, so objects, etc. So things which have always been important for me. So it's not only my work, let's say shoes, but it's a more opened exhibition.
Stilettos are now politicized, right? You're either not a feminist or you're too much of a feminist. Do you ever feel like we shouldn't put politics in shoes?
You know, it's funny because when I was a kid at school, and there was this big trend of like flat shoes and boots, etc. And I always loved every form of shoes. Apart from clogs, I've always loved flat, high heel, etc. But that was a time where in 70s where women would not wear high heels, and I already loved high heels. And I remember saying, because there was this discussion, kids discussion, like if you're on a high heels, you have to be stupid. And you had all the 17 songs, and you're such a stupid girl, well, all that type of songs, like sort of against that. And I always, my reference, my first and only reference was Tina Turner. I said, Tina Turner is always on high heels, and she's a role model like no one else. So, you know, that was my only answer to that. I said, how can you criticize people thinking? Just look at Tina Turner. She's a representation of someone who's been driving her life, who's been incredible, an incredible artist. She's always been on her heels, and she stands by her heels. So, you know, and again, I just don't want to do the apology of high heels. You know, everything is possible. My first shoes were actually flat shoes. I always designed flat shoes. So the perception of work of people is also very much transported by, you know, just one category of person, then a second. And but I have a passion for every shoes, basically.
Yeah, we were talking about, you know, I guess the model of the shoe, but also the color, the nudes, right? How many nude colors do you have?
Right now, it's 8 shades of nudes, going on 9.
Are those your best sellers?
It's interesting because the nudes, I started to do a collection of nudes in 2012. And so I started with 5 shades of nudes, and now going all the way to 8 and 9. And it's very interesting because there is by country, it really reflects the complexion of the skin. For instance, if you take India, which is a subcontinent, it's interesting to see that the colors that we call the color number 4 and number 5, which are already sort of dark. So south of India has darker skin, and we sell more the color after, which is number 6, so darker. North of India, where the complexion goes from dark to less dark, we sell the color which is less dark. So it's really attached to the fact that nudes goes to your color of your skin, and it disappears. That's why it's called nudes, you know, it disappears. It's not a color, it's a shade which is dedicated to disappear on your skin.
Do you know who your best client is? Or how many best clients do you have?
You know, the very nice thing is that I get to meet a lot of people, and a lot of people are saying, I am your biggest client. And sometimes the person says, I have over 9 pairs of shoes of you. And then someone else is going to say, I have over 400 pairs of you. And so I love the idea that, you know, if you like the work of someone, you feel dedicated and engaged to it. So, you know, according to who you are, according to your possibilities, you know, you're the best with 9, and you can be the best with 400. It doesn't make a difference. You know, the important is that people feel great and happy with what I'm doing.
How have consumer trends changed in the last 15, 20 years? Are we talking about stilettos, but are there certain parts of the world that buy more of your shoes than others?
You know, I think that there is not a global, let's say, Louboutin customer. It really depends on where you live. It depends on your climate, the heat, etc. And then after, some styles can come back. But the consumer has changed. No, I mean, what has changed is the habits. You know, what I would say is that women are not so letting themselves being dictated by trends and things. You know, more and more people sort of have a feeling of how they feel good or how they look good, and so that has changed. I have the feeling that, you know, what was imposed in a way by often magazines and things, etc. Now people have their most of the time have a point of view. So they decide, yes, it fits, yes, it doesn't fit for me. And so that would be the change. But then after, you know, I think that a woman works, so she has different moments in her day. She has a moment where she wants to feel empowered. She may want to have a pair of heels, and then she has to run. She will have another pair of shoes. You know, you have a lot of shoes corresponding to different time of the day and different time of the life of a woman.
When we look at your business, so there's women's shoes, there's men's shoes, there's handbags, and there's also beauty. How will that change in the next 5 to 10 years? Will you focus more on men's or handbags, or?
You know, the fun part of my work is to let myself going with the flow in a way. I did not I did not think of doing men's shoes, for instance, when I started with women's shoes. And I ended up doing men's shoes just sort of for me, for one party, for a few friends of mine. And then I really started because a singer, a young pop star, asked me, I didn't know him, I knew of his music, but I didn't know him. He asked me to do shoes for his shows. He was touring. And then because of that, I started to do a collection. He didn't need a collection. And then it became the first collection that I did for men. And then so I just entered that business, that section of the business, just as simple as that, you know, because I had a project for one person. So I let myself being carried by what happens with what I'm living, the people I meet, etc. I don't really have like those very, very specific type of long-term project. So to tell you where I'm going to be in 10 years, that's very complicated.
What about handbags?
Handbags, I started again a while ago, but I sort of wanted the handbags to be, you know, like from the same family. Let's say you have a sister, you would have a sister, you know, I meet your sister, I can see where is, you know, where is not the gemelity, but what you would have in common in terms of family. But if you are not with your sister, you are an entire person. So I wanted the same thing for the bags, to have their own identity, but when you put the two together, there is something in common, which is attention to details, quality. That's one thing that I want to keep. But otherwise, it's almost is separated.
But you have a very romantic way of speaking about business, but do you ever worry that actually there's going to be, that you do too many things? Or do you not worry about it?
No, because if you, let's say if you think about it, I started my company 28 years ago, and so it's very little what I sort of branching out. You know, I got so many proposals, some sort of crazy, some quite interesting, but I'm conscious that if you want to do your job well, you have to concentrate, and I cannot spread myself everywhere all the time.
No. Christian Louboutin, thank you so much for joining us.
Merci.
Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
When opportunity knocks at the door, don't say, blimey, I've still got my pajamas on. Say yes to stuff and it'll take you interesting places.
We're clearly going through some very unusual times and, you know, enormous difficulties getting groups of people to agree on things.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the City of London, join us on Leaders with Lacroix.
Over the last 30 years, I've seen a lot of crises, and I've managed through some of them myself. But nothing I've ever seen before is like the crisis we now have. It's a health crisis, it's an energy crisis, it's a financial crisis. The combination of all those has made the job of being a CEO extraordinarily difficult. I want to talk to CEOs now and see how they're living through this crisis. I want to see how they're dealing with their customers. How are they dealing with their employees? How are they dealing with the government? How are they going to rise up to the occasion? What's going to make these CEOs great? That's what I want to know. This is Leadership Live. Today, I'm very pleased that Ken Frazier, the CEO and chairman of Merck, is my special guest. Ken, thank you very much for doing this.
It's a pleasure, David.
Merck is one of the great vaccine manufacturers in the world and has been for some time. I think you are among the original people that did the measles vaccine, most recently the Ebola vaccine.
Correct.
So when the government of the United States announced they were going to give money to 5 companies to come up with vaccines, you were not one of them. Is there a reason you didn't want to be in that program? And what are you actually doing now to develop a vaccine?
Well, we actually got a little bit of money through the program from BARDA. We got about $38 million. But by and large, I think our approach to coming up with vaccines is we try to make sure that we are focused only on the science. So funding considerations to us are secondary. And we're working on 2 different vaccines right now. Both of those vaccines have certain things in common. The first of which is that we believe they both can confer protection with a single dose, which we think is extremely important. Both of these vaccines give the promise of being able to be deployed broadly. And in the history of the world, there's never been one vaccine that had to be given to every person on the earth, all 7.5 billion. And then the last thing is that we wanted to use proven platforms.
So messenger RNA, which is being used by Moderna, are you comfortable that that can work, or you're not as sure that that will be able to work?
Well, that's not a technology that we're pursuing. I think one of the great things about this whole COVID-19 vaccine situation is there are about 160 different vaccine programs that are pending with very different technologies. Messenger RNA, actually, some people think that will offer the promise of speed. But for us, again, we wanted to make sure that we have a proven platform and have confidence that a vaccine could be done with one dose. And so Merck has a lot of experience with a form of vaccine that's a weakened virus vaccine, an attenuated virus vaccine. That's what we've done before. That's what we know. And therefore, that's where we went.
Some of the companies have been given billions of dollars by the federal government. Is that an unfair advantage to somebody like you that's gotten, relatively speaking, a modest amount? Is that something you're worried about, or you don't care?
Well, you know, I won't say I don't care. I have to manage a P&L, David. But at the same time, as I said at the outset, we want to be able to pursue this in a scientifically rigorous, orderly way. And so for us, we think if we're able to come forward with a vaccine, and we're confident that we will, we think the funding will eventually be there. So I don't think it's a disadvantage.
Okay, when you say you're confident they will come through, when is, I guess, the question you get asked all the time. When will there be a vaccine? At the end of this year, early next year, middle of next year?
Well, I won't speak to other people's vaccine programs, but what I would say is that we expect to go into human testing with our vaccines, both of them by the end of the year. What I can tell you is that the fastest vaccine ever developed was our mumps vaccine, and that took 4 years. So now we know that the urgency of the situation is going to cause us to try to move quickly, but never, ever at the expense of safety.
So human trials, do you mean phase 1, phase 2, phase 3? What phase are you in now?
We're thinking about going into human trials. Often you can call those phase 1/phase 2 trials if they're designed in the right way. The FDA came out recently with some very thoughtful guidance. And what they've said, among other things, is that they wouldn't even approve a vaccine for emergency use unless there was 6 months of observation of data. So that gives you a sense that the fastest it could be is, let's say, a year from now.
Well, some companies that are getting money from the federal government under the Operation Warp Speed program are actually manufacturing the vaccine already on the hope that they get approved. Are you manufacturing the vaccine that you're developing, or you're not manufacturing it yet?
No, we're scaling up to be able to make hundreds of millions of doses of both vaccines. So that's another example of what I mean about trying to compress the time period without sacrificing safety in any way. So we're going to be prepared if the data bears out that one or both of these vaccines are useful from a safety, efficacy, from a risk-benefit standpoint. We're going to be ready to come forward with hundreds of millions of doses in fairly short order.
Well, 2 questions that arise if there is a vaccine is, how do you get it? What's the distribution, and how much does it cost? So how are you going to decide who gets this vaccine first?
So I'm glad you raised the distribution issue, because often people are talking about the scientific conundrum of coming forward with a vaccine that works. In some ways, maybe even a harder problem is what you just put your finger on, which is distribution. So again, I say again, this is a global pandemic. It's everywhere in the world. I often say that none of us are safe until all of us are safe. So it's got to be given broadly to humanity. So we need a vaccine that we can make and distribute around the world. Now, one of the challenges on distribution, and I'll be blunt, is that we're seeing a lot of sort of nationalistic a desire to make sure that one country gets it before the other. And the challenge for us is that we believe that the vaccine should go first to certain populations. So let's say frontline health workers should get it early. People who are particularly vulnerable because of their age or because of their comorbid conditions, their other sicknesses, ought to get it next. And so the challenge for us in the first instance is to make sure that we get it to the people who need it most, but also beyond that, to make sure that we can get it to people in the US, other countries in the Western world, but very importantly, it's also got to get to people in the developing countries where they don't have the ability to pay. And Merck has a long history, frankly, of working with governments and nonprofits to make sure that our vaccines are broadly, accessibly, and affordably available.
Some people say that pharmaceutical companies make too much money, and as you know, there's no politician that doesn't like to run against a pharmaceutical company. The drug companies are always getting beat up, and I think there are very few people you can criticize anymore, but one of the people you can criticize is drug companies. So why is it that drug companies have an image that they're charging too much?
Well, that's a complicated question. Let me first start by acknowledging that there have been some bad actors. Generally speaking, those bad actors, however, are not in the part of the industry that we are in. I think the public thinks of it as one monolithic industry. Often when you've seen these price gougers, they are people who have a single product, usually a generic, for which there's no other source, and they jack the price up. We're a research-based pharmaceutical company. We spend every year a significant amount of money. Last year, almost $10 billion on R&D. That's 21 cents on every dollar of revenue. And so when you look at our business, you have to think about, what's the cost of capital for a business that puts that much money at risk for that long a period of time, and it takes 12 to 15 years to develop a drug. And this is a business that's characterized by failure. What do I mean by that, David? For every 100 programs that we think are important enough to proceed with, we find out that more than 90% are not the right idea. So this is a business that's characterized by failure. And so what people tend to do is they look at the relatively few winners and they say, look how much money you're making on that drug, not recognizing that you have to pay for all the failures.
Are you worried that the U.S. economy will not come back anytime soon and we're going to be in this recession for quite some time?
I am worried about the economy, but at the end of the day, with whether you're a small, medium, or large business, the best customers are the ones that are healthy. And if we don't have healthy customers, the economy can't come back anyways.
Experience may sort of revitalize some of my ability to reach younger audiences, inspire young girls and women to reach a little higher, be a little bolder, inspire young men to recognize that these are things people do, not only men or only women. We live on an ocean planet. More aspects of our life and well-being are determined by and set by and provided by the ocean than most of us think about. Every other breath you take, you can consider that as oxygen provided by plankton in the ocean. That's how critically dependent each and every one of us is on the ocean around us.
Many CEOs with whom I've talked in this program say, well, people are working remotely, and eventually they'll come back, but they're not rushing to come back. And they don't actually say they're going to hire everybody back because maybe they've learned to be more efficient or not sure the business is going to be there. Are you sure that all your employees will want to come back to work in the office? And are you sure you will need all those employees over the next couple of years?
I think the way in which people work in the office context is permanently changed. I think there will always be a reason for a workplace. People need to collaborate, they need to exchange ideas. But I think we've seen that for many office-based employees, they can be just as productive at home as they can be in the office many times. Now, obviously, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're manufacturing medicines and vaccines, you're doing discovery in laboratories, that's all wet stuff. You can't do that from your home office. You've got to be in the laboratory or in the manufacturing plant. But by and large, I'm confident that this pandemic will not cause Merck to be in a position where it will have to furlough or lay off people. Our people are doing a lot of hard work. We've been able to maintain the supply of drugs. We've been able to maintain our clinical trials with our people scattered all around. They're very devoted, and we're devoted to them.
So when you do manufacturing of the drugs, you actually manufacture them, is that done by most pharmaceutical companies in the United States, or is that like healthcare supplies? We've now learned a lot of it's made in China.
Well, we do have global supply chains, not just in China, but all over the world. We do a lot of manufacturing in Europe. We do a lot of manufacturing in the US, most of it in the US, but we do a fair amount of it in places like China. And I think what people are referring to is that most of the fundamental pharmaceutical ingredients are manufactured in China. So we have these global supply chains. They were designed essentially for efficiency. And I think, again, going back to the concerns that have been raised, now people are saying maybe those supply chains ought to be completely within a country like the United States. I happen to disagree with that. I think these supply chains work well by and large. I think that if we were to try to do that, not only would it be hugely expensive to try to do that, but I don't think they would work as well as the global supply chains that we have now.
Now, the governor of New Jersey, where Merck is based, asked you to co-chair a commission to restart and recover the economy, I guess, in New Jersey, and you're chairing that, co-chairing it with Shirley Tillman, the former president of Princeton. So is it probable that you can reopen through phase 3 in New Jersey, or has there been a concern that the virus is coming back a bit?
I think there is a concern. Recently, Governor Murphy, who is a fantastic governor, has made the decision to pause our phase 2. And the reason for that is, frankly, we look at some of the experience in other places in the country, and we see that where people opened up restaurants for indoor dining and bars, we saw a resurgence of the virus. And from the very beginning, Governor Murphy has made it extremely clear that this is going to be data-driven. We're going to look at things like transmission rates. We're going to look at things like hospitalization rates. We're going to look at things like death rates. We're going to make sure that we don't put New Jersey citizens in a position where they're going to be at risk or unnecessary risk. So I think we will reopen. We'll reopen more slowly than we had hoped to reopen. And I think one data point I would share with you, at one point, New Jersey was number 2 in the country in terms of new cases per 100,000 citizens. Right now, we're number 40. And so to go from the second most cases to number 40 really reflects, first of all, the great frontline healthcare workers we have in New Jersey, but also the leadership of Governor Murphy and his cabinet.
So if phase 3 is going to be postponed a bit, maybe that's going to happen in other states, and we now see in Florida and Texas and other places there's a lot of the virus catching on. Are you worried that the U.S. economy will not come back anytime soon, and we're going to be in this recession for quite some time?
I am worried. The vast majority of Americans, David, work for small businesses. They don't work for companies like Merck. And I worry a little bit about how resilient those small businesses can be, those restaurants, when they've now been told that they have to be closed for longer. So I am worried about the economy, but at the end of the day, with whether you're a small, medium, or large business, the best customers are the ones that are healthy. And if we don't have healthy customers, the economy can't come back anyway. So job number 1 is to protect the American people. and to keep the virus as low as it possibly can be so that it doesn't overwhelm our medical system. And that really comes down to whether or not we as Americans are willing to take the advice we've been given about wearing masks, social distancing, continuing to pay attention to our hygiene, et cetera.
So in the Fortune 500, there are 4 CEOs who are African American. You're one of 4. Are you surprised that in this day and age, there's so few?
I would say that if you had gone back 25 years, the most pessimistic observer would have thought we would have had more than 4 out of 500.
Now, you and I are both trained as lawyers, but I wasn't a good lawyer. You were actually a partner in a major firm, and you were obviously a very good lawyer. But you got out of that business. And how does somebody who has a legal background, you're a graduate of Harvard Law School, how does somebody who has a legal background run a pharmaceutical company? How did it come about that you came to Merck, and how did you become the CEO of that company?
Well, I've been extremely fortunate at all stages of my career. When I was a practicing lawyer, I had great mentors in the private practice of law. But one of my clients was Merck. And I did a lot of trial work for them around the country, actually vaccine trials in those days. And the CEO of Merck in the early 1990s was a guy named Dr. Roy Vagelos. And he was maybe 2 years from retirement, and he called me and he asked me to come up and interview. He promised me that he was going to give me a job in the legal department if I would come. I came for 1 year. I was in the legal department, and then he called me and he switched me out of the legal department. He put me in the business. For my next 6 years, I was in the business. And I think his willingness to take a chance on somebody who wasn't at the company, somebody who was an outside lawyer and was able to say, I think you can do more than practice law, gave me a great opportunity.
What was your background?
So I was born and raised in the inner city of Philadelphia. I guess that's the new term. When I was raised in North Philadelphia, it was known as the ghetto. My father had a third-grade education. He was a janitor, but he had very high standards. He and my mother had extremely high standards. And what changed my life, to be frank, is that the social engineers in Philadelphia, who I didn't know, decided to indulge in an experiment called school desegregation. And so I was put on a bus. In the birth order, my younger sister and I were coming along at a time when this experiment was being run, and we were sent to, frankly, good schools, rigorous schools, and we were given a better education than the people in my neighborhood. My neighborhood high school, Thomas Edison, I'll just say, parenthetically, is famous for one thing. It sent more boys to their death in Vietnam than any high school in the country. So you go from those kinds of schools to rigorous schools, and that closed what I call the opportunity gap that many African-American people in this country still face every day.
So in the Fortune 500, there are 4 CEOs who are African-American. You're one of 4. Are you surprised that in this day and age there's so few? And why do you think there are so few who are becoming CEOs or are CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies?
I would say that if you had gone back 25 years, the most pessimistic observer would have thought we would have had more than 4 out of 500. So I can't say that that's something that doesn't surprise me on one level. On the other level, I think we have to be honest in this country. I think we have to recognize that there's subtleties to our history around race, that people who are African-American, for the most part, find themselves in a situation where they have to overcome some customs, some beliefs, and it's much harder for many African-Americans to find their way to these positions. I just mentioned that Dr. Vagelos brought me out of a law firm and put me here. I think one of his reasons, frankly, because he said this publicly and in a book, is he wanted to have a diverse management team. And so I was brought in part for that reason, but I was also given opportunities, stretch assignments. And so I don't think my experience is typical for African Americans in corporate America.
What have you done to increase or make certain that you have minority employees at Merck since you've been the CEO?
Well, one of the things that we try to do is to make sure that at the senior level, at our board level and at our senior management level, we are a diverse group. And I think if you look at our senior management team, it's probably, if not the most diverse team in large companies, it's close to that. On the other hand, I think you've got to look at all levels of the company. And what we're trying to do inside Merck is to ensure that we create an environment where all employees, irrespective of gender, race, sexual orientation, can reach their full potential. We haven't gotten to where we need to get, I would say, particularly with respect to African Americans at lower levels, below the senior management levels. We have a challenge, and I think we're going to have to step up to that challenge. And the way that you do that is, frankly, you begin to establish targets, and you manage to those targets in the best way you can, consistent with how you have to run your company.
Now, your company not only has an African-American CEO, but an African-American lead outside director, Les Brun, maybe the only kind